If you could please find your seat. Would like to welcome everyone to USDA's 96th Annual Outlook Forum, USDA's oldest annual meeting. I'm Stephen Censky, Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, and it's great to see everyone here this morning. This year's theme is the Innovation Imperative, Shaping the Future of Agriculture. This is a fitting theme for the Secretary to announce something that we've been working on at USDA called the Agriculture Innovation Agenda. We're excited to share more with you this morning. I'm joined in this room by many of you that are working to shape the future of our agriculture economy. It's important that we take stock not only of where we are today, but also of where we need to go to meet a growing global demand with rising standards of living in a time when producers are dealing with uncertainties in the farm economy and the conditions needed to farm, including the climate. Our chief economist, Dr. Rob Johansen, will provide an in-depth overview of the state of the farm economy. There's a lot to take in. 2019 was certainly not a typical year, and there were many factors influencing the economy, including extreme weather, trade and policy changes in importing and exporting countries, to name just a few. Following Dr. J's talk, the Secretary will outline some of the amazing progress we've seen and should be talking about more in the agriculture sector. As I mentioned, he'll also tee up what we're calling on this call to continue the trend of success that we've seen to meet the future challenges, including in doing our part to make sure that we're growing enough food to feed a population that is likely to grow to 9.7 billion people by 2050, while at the same time conserving our natural resources for the future. That will be followed by a fireside chat that the Secretary will have with John Hartnett, founder and CEO of SVG Ventures, a platform of corporations, universities, and investors focused on food and agriculture industries. Secretary Perdue and Dr. Hartnett will discuss the future of agriculture, challenges facing the sector, and emerging solutions that could address them. Tomorrow, Secretary Perdue will be joined by his colleagues as ministers from Argentina, Canada, and Mexico for a plenary session titled Feeding the World Through Innovation. They will discuss cooperative approaches to promoting agriculture innovation and global trade as foundations of global food security. A recurring theme that you'll hear through this conference is this: innovation. Innovation will be the key to sustaining the success of our sector. Here at USDA, we are working to reframe this narrative on agriculture. Speaking of the future, I also want to acknowledge our 30 university students who are in attendance as participants in this year's Agriculture Outlook Forum. They're here participating in USDA's 2020 Future Leaders in Agriculture program. Their attendance in this forum caps off a week-long trip here to Washington, D.C. The program selects 20 university undergraduates and 10 graduate students based on essays on agriculture careers and challenges. These students major in agriculture-related studies, including business, economics, communications, nutrition, food science, and veterinary studies. Finalists are selected from land-grant universities, Hispanic serving institutions, and non-land grant colleges of agriculture. The Future Leaders in Agriculture program is supported by academic institutions, corporations, and government institutions dedicated to promoting the education of the next generation of agriculture. This year's sponsoring organizations include the University of Maryland Eastern Shore and Farm Credit. This program is one of the many efforts that we have among USDA, the 1862 land-grant institutions, the 1890 historically black colleges and universities, the 1994 tribal land-grant colleges and universities, and Hispanic-serving universities. These partnerships support capacity-building initiatives and bolster education and career opportunities for students interested in a career in agriculture. I also want to acknowledge, as part of that, the 10 graduate students that we have in attendance as part of that program. The USDA's Economic Research Service partnered last year with the Farm Foundation to create a new Agriculture Scholars Program that takes these 10 graduate-level students of agriculture through a year-long program of ag-related training. The objective is to inspire and train the next generation of agriculturalists interested in policy, commodity market analysis, agriculture finance, and other applied fields of economics. Can we have all of our 2020 Future Leaders in Agriculture program attendees stand, and let's give them a round of applause. Be sure to seek them out during the breaks, because these are some of the sharp young minds that we want in agriculture, and I know you want as well. With that, I would like to say here is our Chief Economist, Dr. Robert Johansen, who will unveil the Department's outlook for U.S. commodity markets and trade in 2020 and discuss the U.S. farm income situation. Dr. Johansen.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Thank you for those comments, Mr. Deputy Secretary. And of course, welcome to the 96th Annual Agricultural Outlook Forum. As the Deputy just mentioned, we have a great program for you. Our theme this year, as he just talked about, the innovation imperative. Of course, that's appropriate in many ways. He just enumerated some of them. I'll just highlight two that are going to underline some of the comments I make today. First, 2019 was a year filled with uncertainty for agriculture in many ways, and innovative responses were necessary by farmers to get them through the year. And second, we know that innovation in agriculture will continue to shape our future. What can we expect for 2020? I know you're waiting with bated breath, so let's get to the numbers. I want to talk about three main themes today. 2020 is a big year for trade, of course, with our top agricultural partners, and that's going to help sales and prices. Second, crop production should rebound from last year, and we expect record crop, meat, and dairy production. Third, the economy continues to show signs of stress, the ag economy, but there are other more hopeful signs. For example, low interest rates are reducing borrowing costs and strengthening land values. Let's start with the global economy. In January, the IMF projected slower global economic growth. The downward revisions from the pink to the dark red line on the slide there may not look like much, but it equals a loss in buying potential of $1.5 trillion over that period, with almost all of that revision due to declines in growth in emerging economies such as India. Central banks from across the world have responded by collectively cutting interest rates 71 times across 49 different countries. Still, that being said, higher global growth in 2021 and 2022 is expected, which should increase our opportunities to sell abroad. Now, those estimates by the IMF did not account for the most recent outbreak of the coronavirus in China, which has been impacting much of China's economy. You can see here in January that the Shanghai Composite Index fell by 10% in January with the emergence of the coronavirus, but it's since started to recover. We're tracking this on many levels. Globally, we've observed significant disruptions in shipping and supply chains, and we would expect less spending by Chinese consumers, particularly in the first quarter. That may reduce their purchases of higher valued products such as meats. Private sector forecasts have lowered their estimates of China's first quarter GDP by as much as 2 percentage points. It's far too early to tell what the final impacts will be, but most of those forecasting operations expect the second quarter, third quarter, and fourth quarter in China to rebound. Any perceived risk or of uncertainty often strengthens the U.S. dollar, and that's what we saw last year as a safe investment. Trade uncertainty and interest rate cuts kept the dollar strong in the first part of 2019, but over the second half of the year, the dollar depreciated against several currencies. We saw a moderation of tensions between the U.S. and China. We saw resolving uncertainty about Brexit, And we did see some higher oil prices in the end of the second half of 2019, which supported both the Australian and the Canadian currencies. We also saw interest rate cuts, as I mentioned earlier, by some central banks, such as in Russia, which helped support their currencies, such as the ruble. And incidentally, the coronavirus recently has led to an appreciating dollar that's not reflected in these slides. Despite the mixed economic signals heading into 2020, there has been important progress on trade that I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot over the next 2 days. And that's going to improve access for U.S. agriculture in 2020 and beyond. 3 main trade deals that we'll hear about today and tomorrow cover over half of U.S. exports. The USMCA will lower trade friction between our North American trading partners and is expected to grow the U.S. export market to more than $41 billion in 2020. The Japan-U.S. agreement will also help lower tariffs on more than $7 billion in U.S. ag exports. But more importantly, it will equalize market access for sectors such as U.S. beef and pork, similar to those enjoyed right now by the EU, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada into Japan and their large $7 trillion market. And the Phase 1 deal with China will boost sales to our main agricultural customer. However, there remains much more work to do, such as gaining better access to the nearly 1.4 billion consumers in India. And our trading negotiators and administration and president are working on that as we speak. All right, I'm going to put up a slide here, and hopefully this works. This is the first time I've tried this, but this shows some of what we're expecting in trade and excited to see. So this is a timeline of different economies, and the size of the bubble reflects how much we're trading with that, or how much U.S. product they're purchasing from us. And their per capita GDP is along the x-axis. So a lot going on there. What did we see? We saw 3 decades ago, Japan was our largest market for U.S. exports at about $8 billion. They were, at that same time, our exports were concentrated mostly in the EU and Canada. U.S. exports at that time to China were less than $1 billion, and exports to India were only $240 million. At the time, China had GDP per capita of about $700 a person, and India at $600 a person. This changed dramatically. NAFTA took effect. You probably saw that in 1994. U.S. ag exports to Canada and Mexico grew 300%. In 1995, WTO officially commenced, boosting market access globally. In 2001, China entered the WTO, and U.S. exports to China expanded, hitting almost $26 billion in 2014. U.S. exports over the past half-decade have declined under increased foreign competition, and in 2018, exports slowed dramatically under the disputes with our major trading partners, bringing us to, we'll watch it one more time, and then I'll go to the next slide. So I just talked about all this. We can see China and India starting together. Boom, China opens to the global marketplace, starts growing dramatically, both in per capita GDP as well as our exports. And India yet to take off, but again, highlighting the importance of getting into that market in the future. Where are we today in 2020? U.S. ag exports are forecast at $139.5 billion. That's up $4 billion from last year. China, we're forecasting right now at $14 billion for fiscal 2020. Up from $10 billion last year. Now that reflects public information available right now on Phase 1, but the trade outlook forecasts are based on a fiscal year, and this outlook also reflects uncertainty that I mentioned earlier. Our top market in 2020 is currently expected to be Canada, forecast at $21.5 billion, and Mexico forecast up to $19.8 billion. EU and Japan slightly down for fiscal 2020. Again, just to emphasize the calendar year, Phase 1 commitments are not reflected in a fiscal year calculation completely. One question we get is, where do we expect the largest growth to be in import demand over the next 10 years? Global demand for agricultural commodities, especially emerging markets, are expected to grow global exports. The prospect for additional U.S. exports over the next 10 years is strong, growing at least to $183.6 billion. Overall, world coarse grain trade is projected to increase by 37 million tons, up 17%, with big markets in Mexico, Egypt, and South America. Global soybean trade is projected to increase by 36 million tons, up 24%, mostly in China, Global wheat trade is projected to increase by 30 million tons, up 16% mainly in Africa and the Middle East. And the world meat trade is expected to grow by 9 million metric tons, poultry up 28%, beef by 18%, and pork by 23%. All right, let's turn to the 2020 crop and livestock sector. I know many of you are excited to see these slides. First, let's recap, though, in 2019 what we saw and which drew a lot of attention and critiques of USDA forecasts. As we all know, 2019 was a very wet year in much of America. Spring planting delays led to slow maturing corn and soybean crops, and at harvest, wet weather still hindered progress across wide areas of the Corn Belt. That led to a surge in demand for drying capacity, and some natural gas shortages and price spikes occurred in many areas. In parts of North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, early heavy snowfall on top of wet ground ended field work early before the harvest was complete, leaving significant acreage for harvest in the spring. As you know, today we're coming out with our early estimates for the 2020 year, and this is what we had last year for corn in 2019. Our estimates are based at this time purely on supply and demand fundamentals and price expectations, and we do assume, quote unquote, normal weather. Of course, we know it's fairly wet out there right now. The first official estimates for the new crop year in the WASDE are released in May, and that reflects the planting intention surveys that NASS will release at the end of March. In June last year, we reduced our acreage and yields, reflecting observed weather conditions at the end of June. NASS released its acreage report, which was used in the July WASDE. Given the high corn prices and strong price signals at that time to plant corn, it is not surprising that farmers said they would plant more corn, and that was reflected in the July estimates. In August, NASS begins to report monthly survey-based data, acreage and yield estimates, which are coupled with administrative data and satellite information. As you all know, in August, NASS surveys came in from producers noting fewer acres planted than expected, but higher yields than had been forecast earlier. Overall, the corn harvest was pegged at roughly 13.9 billion bushels, slightly above the July estimates, but significantly different from the average trade estimate from many, probably of you in the room, by more than 600 million bushels. What did we see? Many farmers outside and outside analysts felt that the USDA estimates did not reflect the poor planting conditions that were seen on the ground in many states. What the estimates did reflect was what farmers were saying on their surveys, coupled with satellite information as well as administrative data from FSA and RMA. A market correction happened in August, with the December futures falling quickly by almost 50 cents a bushel, further frustrating farmers that were dealing with difficult planting conditions. One thing we heard this year is, why doesn't USDA use satellite information to help them with their estimates? Of course, we've been using satellites for many years, and we've been getting better each year as those data improve our ability to estimate crop production. You can see how improved satellite information and improved usage of administrative data have helped USDA refine their estimates over time, going back to the 70s. We haven't seen a year when the corn crop forecast in August was more than 7.5% off since 1995. And the deviation has been less than 5% over the past 5 years. Again, in the blue here is our estimates in August relative to the final, and the orange is the average trade estimate relative to the final. Let's look ahead now to 2020. Big question out there is, where are we going to plant all those acres? Our 8 major row crops, corn, soybeans, wheat, upland cotton, sorghum, rice, barley, and oats, averaged nearly 257 million acres over the 2012-2014 period. Looking at the principal crop acreage for the NASS principal crops, acreage was down in 2019 by almost 16 million acres, which most of that coming from soybeans, down 13 million relative to 2018. So again, looking across the United States, we saw significant planting, prevent plant and unplanted acres in 2019 relative to 2018, so where are we going to put those acres this year? We would expect a good portion of those to go to corn and soybeans in 2020. Let's look at what the price fundamentals are. We look at global stocks relative to use at first to see what we think about the upcoming demand for those commodities, and we can see strengthening in the balance sheet or the stocks to use for corn and soybeans relative to wheat and rice. So we would expect better returns vis-a-vis those commodities for corn and soybeans. Similarly, we expect growing global demand for varied diets and increasing animal proteins to continue to stimulate demand for feed grains and soybeans. And here we see it's not just the United States that are improving their output, but Brazil is optimizing their land as well, utilizing double cropping, resulting in more soybean acres and a second crop corn now that has overtaken Brazil's first season crop. Current record production in Brazil is pegged at roughly 4 billion bushels of corn and 4.6 billion bushels of soybeans. In addition, planning decisions will be affected by a number of other factors, such as expectations about trade and tariffs and prices compared with rising input costs. The current futures prices point to a large U.S. corn crop. The soybean to corn price ratio has dipped to 4-year lows. In addition, we know that local demand and transportation costs will drive regional plantings. For example, we see that soybean to corn prices currently favors the planting of more soybeans in the upper Midwest compared to planting more corn in the eastern corn belt as well as the southeastern part of the United States. Under anticipation of return to normal trade, with some growth in those markets boosted by trade agreements, we project that soybean prices will rise modestly up a nickel to $8.80 a bushel this coming year, supported by lower stocks compared to last year's record level. In contrast, corn is expected to decline 25 cents to $3.60 a bushel, with larger corn acres and expected return to trend yields. Wheat prices are expected up 35 cents to $4.90 a bushel, reflecting low ending stocks. Cotton prices remain low. However, global conditions and the return to more normal trading patterns with China remain a significant uncertainty for the cotton market in the coming year. Cropland area. Last year's planting difficulties, as I mentioned, resulted in 13 million fewer acres of soybeans compared to, which is equivalent to roughly a 600 million bushel carryout. That reduction supports an increase in soybean acreage to roughly 85 million acres, up 12%. Corn area is expected to rise 4.3 million acres to 94 million following last year's prevent plant, supported by new crop prices that are relatively favorable to corn. Wheat and cotton acres are down, with more acres planted to rice. Let's turn to meat and dairy production. 2020 production of meat will set another record at 108.8 billion pounds. Beef production will increase about 1%, pork about 4.5%, and broiler production up about 4%. The increase in production over the past 10 years has been accompanied by increasing shares of production exported, with more than 25% of our pork production expected to be exported and nearly 20% of dairy being exported. I'll just note, of course, we've got record dairy production as well in the red there at more than 220 billion pounds expected for 2020. I'm going to let you take a look at this slide real fast while I get a sip of coffee. There's a lot going on here, but this tries to encapsulate what's going on with African swine fever in one slide. There's a lot going on. I can even use a pointer on this one. So what have we seen? We've seen significant declines in pork production, China in particular. China hog production in 2019 down 195 million head, and we expect a reduction of another 80 million in 2020. Chinese pork prices have spiked to 150 to 200% of what they were a year ago. You can see in 2019, most exporting countries, particularly the EU, increased their pork exports to China. And China has dramatically increased their imports globally, with purchases from the U.S. up 150% from 2018. With the Phase 1 deal in place, we would expect a larger portion to come from the U.S. in 2020. But let's look at the loss in China consumption and supplies. It's far larger than all of global trade in pork, and will take some time to resolve. So again, the drop in China consumption, significant, 15.8 million metric tons. Total trade, 4 million metric tons plus another 7 gets you only to 11. So we've got a significant hole there in proteins that is going to be filled with other proteins such as beef, poultry, and again, higher exports of pork coming from the United States. What do prices show? Despite record levels of beef production, steer prices are expected to close unchanged for 2020, slightly up. Strong demand for pork domestically and internationally is expected to support increased hog prices. Broiler prices are expected to come under pressure from higher production levels, going down slightly but fairly unchanged. And milk prices are expected to strengthen slightly in 2020 as well. Let's look a little bit closer at dairy. You've heard a lot about that in the news over the past year. We know that U.S. milk production is expected to grow by 13% over the next 10 years, but milk prices are only expected to increase about 5%. As with other sectors, growth in production has been through increased gains in animal efficiency, with steady increases in milk per cow. However, dairy remains a sector experiencing significant structural reform, and the number of licensed herds has been falling as production has been increasing. The recent USDA-NASS census shows how the distribution of dairy farming operations has been changing from one with many small dairy farms to one with fewer but much larger operations. Now, more than half of U.S. dairy cows are being milked in operations with 1,000 or more cows, 5 times higher than we saw 20 years ago. And the reason for this is apparent in this chart showing the cost of production for dairy farms across the United States. The chart shows that the majority of dairy operations have costs of production that are greater than the all-milk price. But the majority of milk production is occurring on operations with costs higher than the all-milk price. Based on this, we would expect to see continued consolidation in the dairy sector. Let's turn now to the farm economy and farm policies. We know that U.S. farmers, as I mentioned, faced a number of natural disasters in 2019, and USDA responded with all the tools available to it, making timely payments for loss claims and crop insurance policies and utilizing FSA's suite of disaster assistance programs. In addition to those tools, USDA implemented the Wildfire and Hurricanes Indemnity Program, plus using the funding provided by Congress. WIP Plus provided payments in addition to crop insurance to producers affected by natural disasters in 2018 and 19. Stepping back, of course, this is something that I typically show at the beginning of this presentation, but we look at sentiment of farmers over the past year relative to where we were in February of last year. We can see that by and large, most of these indices that we track, whether that's the corn price, consumer sentiment from Michigan, the Ag Barometer from the CME Purdue survey, the Rural Main Street survey that's done by Creighton, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, or the housing market are all up relative to this time last year. But certainly, farmer sentiment was volatile over this period. In May, farm sentiment fell due to increasing trade tensions. May was the lowest overall Purdue Ag Barometer index since October of 2016. In June, the barometer rose with the announcement of the new MFP program for 2019. In July, the price of corn rose with the knowledge of widespread prevent plant, and so did the Ag Barometer. However, in August, as we just talked about, with more corn acres than expected and weaker commodity prices, sentiment fell. In December, with prospects of improved trade relations, farmer sentiment about the future continued to improve. And in January, there was a large boost in optimism as the Phase 1 deal with China was signed by the U.S. This is a new record for this index, for the Ag Barometer Index, indicating that farmers are very optimistic about the next 6 months. Let's turn to farm household income. More than 98% of farms in America are family farms, so farm household income is a good benchmark to look at when thinking about the health of the family farm. We can see that overall family farm household income stretches from let's look at farm household income, stretches from negative $8,000 to more than $300,000, with the median roughly at $72,000. That's typically found to be above the median U.S. household income. However, this chart illustrates there are still roughly 50% of farms out there that do not earn positive returns from farming. And we also know that more than 50% of U.S. farms have principal operators that are either retired or less another job as their primary occupation. A growing U.S. economy helps farm household income, but low commodity prices in recent years have weighed on farm income. Yet farm income, we see, has rebounded slightly since 2016. In part, particularly last year, that was due to high levels of indemnities and government payments. In 2020, we expect net farm income to rise slightly from $93.6 to $96.7 billion with higher cash receipts. But we also expect lower farm program payments and lower indemnities on normal weather, even though input costs will be rising. And we'll talk about that at the end here. Usually when we think of disaster payments, we normally are talking about crop insurance, and that's what we're showing here. But in this case, crop insurance still covers the bulk of most losses due to weather, but we saw in particular an increase in Prevent Plant last year of more than $4 billion. WIP and WIP Plus, along with the top-up for that Prevent Plant, still show up in the 2017 and 18 and 19 numbers as the pink sitting on top of those years. So WIP has been important, but again, this portrays the importance of the crop insurance program to providing that basic safety net for farm producers to weather risk. Similarly, the $14.5 billion in MFP payments for the 2019 program will be paid out in 2019 and 2020. You can see here how those program payments were targeted to the states most affected by the retaliatory tariffs, with MFP exceeding $500 million in 8 states, running from Texas to North Dakota and over to Indiana. The picture of the states there on the right showing trade that's affected by tariffs, and the picture on the left where MFP program payments are expected. For this year, farm debt is forecast at $425 billion, with $265 in real estate debt and $161 billion in non-real estate debt. Overall, the farm sector debt is near its peak from the early 1980s. Equity is forecast to decrease very slightly, 0.7% in 2020, while debt is anticipated to increase slightly by 0.5%. That puts the debt-to-asset ratio for the farm sector at 13.6. That's still low, but certainly it's the highest we've seen since 2003. On the other hand, both interest rates and inflation are expected to remain low in 2020, which has kept debt financing manageable and which has also helped maintain equity through higher farmland values. Those overall values can mask areas of greater vulnerability. The percent of farms with very highly leveraged balance sheets, that's debt-to-asset ratios above 71%, has been slowly rising for several sectors, including corn, soybeans, and hogs. But overall, the number of crop farms in highly or very highly, that's above 0.4 debt-to-asset ratio, is about 1 in 12, and that's remained constant over time. And the number of livestock and dairy farms in highly or very highly leveraged financial situations is sitting at about 1 in 16 right now. Again, fairly constant over time. We've seen a lot about bankruptcies, and I put some slides together on that. The overall bankruptcy rate has remained low, below 3 farms per 10,000 over the past 9 years. And while it's increased year over year by 24%, the rate is still low historically. What is helping with that? Again, both interest rates and inflation remain low, which helps maintain farmland values. If we look at states, there are some that show higher than average bankruptcy rates, such as Georgia, Nebraska, and North Dakota in 2019, but others, such as Maine, Michigan, and Florida, where bankruptcy rates have been lower than the average. By and large, most states had fewer than 2 bankruptcies per 10,000 farms, in line with the historic average. Again, the red line here being on average. If you're below the red line, that would mean that in 2019 you had higher bankruptcies, the state had higher bankruptcies than the 10-year average. If you're above the red line, lower bankruptcies than the 10-year average. Overall, going into 2020, the basic outlook for many farms look better than it did last year. We have expectations of better trade, expectations of better weather, and continued low interest rates. Nevertheless, the farm balance sheet remains tight for farms without significant land equity. Total costs, including land rent, generally exceed expected revenues in many regions, with cash flow difficult for corn and for soybeans and wheat in particular. Of course, this balance sheet does not include government payments, so ARC PLC is not included in here. The 2019 Tranche 3 payments for MFP are not included in here. But this just underlines that in many places, farmers that are renting land are going to have a difficult time showing cash flow. If you own your own land, it's a different story, of course, because that's the highest input cost that's here. So farmers that do have significant land equity are in a better shape going into 2020. Let me put some summary slides together here. First of all, current conditions, as I pointed out, point towards an improved outlook in 2020. Trade deals are expected to improve our access and trading opportunities abroad, and a return to more normal trade with our major trading partners with lower friction should lower costs for producers and improve returns. The economic fundamentals are stable. Interest rates remain low, and that will keep borrowing costs down. Equity remains high relative to debt, and we have stable land values. Weather conditions are likely to be better. Of course, that's hard to forecast going into the new year. We do know there's a lot of rain out there, a lot of wetness, a lot of precipitation that we've seen over the last couple weeks and months. But again, we would expect that conditions will be better than the historic conditions we saw last year, and that should improve outlook for corn and soybean crops as well as other commodities. We do see corn and soybean acres likely to be up from 2019 based on price signals that we're seeing right now. Livestock sector is poised for continued growth with record production in beef, pork, and poultry. Growing export access for meat exports reflecting the Phase 1 deal with China, the U.S.-Japan agreement, and continued global income growth in 2020 and 2021. International competition in crop and livestock production is intense, particularly with our countries to the south. In Brazil, we continue to see corn and soybean expansion in production. U.S. agricultural productivity remains remarkably strong. That's something we're going to hear about over the next couple days, with continued investment in technology and innovation key to maintaining markets, profitability, and feeding a global population. So what are our expectations for the next 10 years? Production of crops in the U.S. should reach 612 million metric tons over the next 10 years. And these are the main commodities we're talking about today, the main 8. That's up about 10% from this time, from current, and that's on the same amount or slightly less cropland. Again, increasing productivity is something we're going to continue to hear about, but it remains one of the only ways to ensure decent livelihoods for U.S. farmers and farm workers. It will help us meet global food security challenges and manage scarce natural resources. We know that markets are competitive, which drives producers to be efficient and to innovate. U.S. farmers have shown time and time again their resilience and ability to compete globally. And we know that more people will have improved access to food in the coming 10 years as food prices fall and economic growth boosts purchasing power. Yet, much work remains. The number of people who are food insecure in 2018 had risen to 820 million, roughly 10% of the global population. U.S. producers and U.S. innovators have a vital role to play in responding to that demand. We can see that the number of undernourished is moving in the wrong direction here if we are to meet our UN target of zero hunger by 2030. As I mentioned, U.S. producers and innovators will have a vital role to play in responding to the demand in a sustainable way to challenges facing agriculture, such as limited land, water, and natural disasters. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce USDA's 31st Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue. He will be speaking today about USDA's agricultural innovation agenda and will sit down with his guest, John Hartnett, to talk about that innovation imperative. Please welcome Secretary Perdue. Can you get this out of your way?
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Looks like we got a full house here today, and we are delighted to have you here to the 96th annual Agricultural Outlook Summit. It looks like some of you may have, raise your hand if you were here at the first one. I think looking out there, some of you may have made it the first one, so we're happy to have you here today. And this, our theme this year is the Innovation Imperative, Shaping the Future of Agriculture. So we're delighted to have you here. And the story today we're going to talk about, I don't think we've told the story of agriculture very well. And what we're going to be doing over this next year is sharing where we've been as far as a footprint for where we want to go. And that's going to include certainly an agricultural success story, but an agenda. Now, for all you honor students, you don't need to read that all at one time. I'm going to go one by one, okay? So for you valedictorians out there trying to take notes, we'll have more of that going forward. But really, the success story of American agriculture, what we haven't done. Farmers are pretty good about producing. They're just not good about telling what they've done. And most of them are kind of quiet, sit behind the farm gate, and really don't talk a lot about what's happened. But this is the facts, the story of the last 90 years of U.S. agriculture. A 400% increase in food and fiber production and increased productivity with fewer resources. And that's what the story is here. What does that mean in that way? It means that we've opened export opportunities. In fact, if we look at trade over the last couple of years, we've offered export necessities. And because we're producing more than we can consume here, we're contributing to the trade balance here in the United States. But more importantly, we've kept food prices low, reliable for our American farm families, consumer families all over this country in an amazing way. So that's what's making Americans spend less on their paycheck than almost anywhere, or really anywhere in the world. And we've got some facts to back that up. So here's what the story of American agriculture has been. It's producing more with fewer inputs. And we see just over the past 70 years, U.S. outputs almost tripled here. 3 times up there, while inputs have only increased by 0.1% annually. So you can see here the line of total agricultural output, and what our economists say, Dr. Johansson would tell us the total factor productivity for agriculture has been wonderful in that way of the measuring the inputs versus the outputs versus the inputs, which you see down here with the inputs there. So it's been a great story. And the measure is an indicator of how efficient our agricultural sector has been and become over that past 70 years. And it's a great story to tell. And we really haven't done that. But how have we gotten there? And this is the key. Innovation has made this possible. We know that farmers are great innovators. They're great entrepreneurs. They're great ingenuity. And many of the OEM equipment we see from the majors today started in a farm shed somewhere. You know that. Farmers were looking for a better way to do whatever they needed to do. They designed things, they welded it, they built it, and they've innovated their way to success, and that's what has made this possible. Farmers aren't always the biggest advocates for their own successes. They tend to stay behind the farm gate and go to the farm shed and do what they need to do in order to become better about what they're doing. So, but it's important for us to illustrate the truth about American agriculture, and it's really important as we go forward in doing that. So, we understand that the United States model of private sector innovation and our science-based regulatory approach encourages farmers to adapt the latest technologies there. And that's what we want to do. You see the productivity increases here from technological advances there. We see all the way back to 1929, the rubber-tired tractors here and all the various types of things, irrigation and robotic milking and no-till and satellites for precision agriculture, really biotech issues, drought-tolerant research, all those kind of things. Innovation has driven, technological innovations have helped to that record place of 400% improving agricultural productivity over these years. So that's why we want to continue to do that. We've got to focus more on aligning those kind of things as we go forward in that way. So embracing innovative technologies allows farmers to become more efficient while ultimately improving their bottom lines, keeping costs low and productivity high. So even in the dairy sector, which has been under quite a bit of stress, you can see their productivity gains over the last several years. 90 years ago, we had this many cows, and now we have 60% less fewer cows with, guess what? Twice as much milk. And that's one of the reasons dairy is so much sector, because they've been so productive. We've overproduced really to keeping these costs low for our consumers, while the livelihood of dairies has been under stress. So the interesting thing over here, at the same time, we hear a lot about methane emissions from cattle and dairy cattle. Methane emissions per gallon of milk have dropped over 50% as we've gone forward there. We see also, we know about precision ag, the digitalization of agriculture and adoption of precision agricultural technologies is enabling farmers to, again, to improve productivity. I remember when I went to the Farm Progress Show in 2017, I saw the sub-inch technology there, ripping that soil in the fall, placing about half the nutrients there that were typically done, and then the spring coming back and placing that seed in that very same sub-inch technology with a 20 bushel per acre increase. That's quantum type of productivity increases that we're seeing in agriculture that's driving the innovation that's driving these kind of technological advances here. Data-driven decision making, this digitization. I was telling John early this morning that, well, the best farmers have used this great AI on top of their shoulders for many years, intuitively making the best decisions. The most successful farmers have been the best about that. But when we're digitizing that, we're going several decimal places to the right where they can make even better decisions, and even the ones that had not been as successful can look at that data and make better digitized decisions going forward for American agriculture. What does that mean? Less inputs, better utilization of water, using sensor technology, optic technology for the future. And again, innovation will continue to drive. But these self-steering vehicles that you see almost on 60% of our arable acres today, regardless of what kind of crop you're growing, pretty amazing. I used to take pride in the kind of straight row, but I can't compete with GPS guidance today, and probably many of you farmers out there can't either when you took a lot of pride in that. But we're going to continue reminding people of the access to reliable, affordable connectivity in rural America. What does it depend on? It depends on rural broadband, not only in the farmsteads, but also in the fields for this corrected kind of precision agriculture to really take place. We're going to have that. I think it's one of the most transformative things we can do from an infrastructure perspective that really matters in American agriculture as we go forward. So we need to continue doing that. Not only have we done a great job productivity-wise, but farmers are doing a much better job from a conservation perspective. That's because they live on the land, and they're smart enough to know they don't want to poison that land for future generations. Any farmer you talk to, their goal is to pass that land along to the next generation. I remember very clearly my father telling me, son, our responsibility, whether we own it or rent it, is to leave it better than we found it. And that's what farmers are doing today, as we see. I think, again, this is important. Since 1980, farmland has decreased over 49 million acres, while forest land has increased over 3 million acres. We know that what that contributes to the greenhouse gas issues in that way. The other thing here, farmers are doing a much better job because they realize it helps their productivity. Rather than having topsoil eroded, they're doing a great job here with 45% decline in soil erosion from 82 to 2012, including water and wind erosion declined by 45%. That's real conservation efforts that I think with modern technology we can even do better, knowing what no-till and what cover crops and conservation tillage now used widely on many major crops, but it's still not universally adopted. What we hope to do is to, again, tell the data and the facts where farmers will adopt these kind of technologies and make a difference in that way. So the good news is it's essentially what the story of American agriculture is doing much, much more with much, much less. And that's what we want to talk about as we go forward. We know, obviously, with all the successes that we have, that there are challenges ahead. There are always going to be challenges. You read about them in the press, you read about them from consumers and others about the challenges going forward. And the challenges of the world population, most people will tell you that the world population is expected to be about 9.7 to 10 billion people by 2050. That's a lot of hungry mouths out there to feed. You may know that our motto at USDA since we began is to do right and feed everyone. That's a challenge, and there are challenges ahead. How are we going to feed everyone while doing right? And that's the sustainability goals that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. The challenges of feeding everyone, almost 10 billion people, while doing right by the environment and our social goals as we go forward. So today we want to announce a new Ag Innovation Agenda going forward. And it's because that's what's going to drive the successes, the Agricultural Innovation Agenda. And the real question is, how are we going to do it? And it's a department-wide effort to better align USDA resources, programs, and research to provide all farmers with the tools they need to be successful and to position American agriculture as a leader in the global effort. We recognize that our role at USDA is to support farmers of all sizes. We see some very innovative smallholder farms creating different things. I was in Michigan a few weeks ago, and this young man that was 32 years old that had left a high-tech, well-paying job was operating on 3 acres, and guess what he was growing? Dahlias for the wedding industry of flowers shipping all over the world in that way. So we've got a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity out there. So we've challenged ourselves to set goals and to prioritize innovation and to hold ourselves accountable. USDA goal is to stimulate the innovation of American agriculture, can achieve that shared goal of doing more with less, increasing U.S. agricultural production by 40% while we reduce our contribution to the footprint by half in 2050. And we think that's attainable. It's a stretch goal. It should be, but we think we can get there. So here's what we're going to do. Stimulate our innovation so that American agriculture can work toward the shared goal of increasing agricultural production by 40% while cutting the environmental footprint by half in U.S. agriculture by 2050. It's going to take all of us to do that. It's going to take alignment to do that between the public sector and the private sector, but that's how we define doing right and feeding everyone as we go forward. So, how will we get there? How will we get there? We're going to get there strategically by working together with an innovative, creative private sector, from the farmer on the ground to our great research, public and private entities here. We're going to do research, we're going to align programs, measure metrics and data, and we're going to have a scoreboard. So that's what we want to do in 4 ways going forward. Research. Our plans are to develop a U.S. Ag innovation strategy that aligns and synchronizes public and private sector research, synergizes that, communicates with one another on what we're doing, where we need to go, what are the questions that we need to answer as far as where we can help to achieve these goals through public and private research going forward. We got so many things differently, genome design, digitalization, automation, prescriptive intervention, and systems based on farm manager. There are many, many kind of things. It's amazing out there. I get a chance to travel really all over the country and all over the world and look at what's happening out here. Simple things, not simple, but interesting things like light spectrum technology regarding their influence on plants, and the kind of opportunities that we've never imagined before. So research is part of that key. Certainly we want to align our programs as our customer-facing opportunities with both FSA, dealing with farmers, NRCS, dealing with our producers out here, and these 2 farmer groups. We want to align the work of that research and deliver it through cooperation with the Extension Service and communication tactics across the globe, of aligning the work of our customer-facing agencies so we can integrate those innovative technologies and practices into our programs. As you well know, many times government regulations lag technology, they lag what is really happening out there in the world. We want to be ahead of that. We want to be certainly shoulder to shoulder aligned from a regulatory perspective, acknowledging the changes that are taking place so we can lead really that way rather than hinder. Many times the private sector is hindered by the technologies that are available because of outdated regulatory structures, and our goal are to align those and move out with the industry as it moves out through innovation and improve the coordination here between our research and our programs so we can fast track the implementation of that cutting edge technology into the hands of our producers everywhere we want to go. So that's important as well. Then, you know, we're going to measure. We have to measure. Metrics and data are important, and the USDA is in a great place to do that, and we need to make sure that we do it in a way that preserves privacy. We know that farmers are very private about their individual data, the same way we would be about our tax returns. We need to guard this data, but the USDA needs to help the private sector in accumulating the data, but also making sure that we preserve that data and use it for the right way as we go forward in moving out, creating a review of productivity, conservation data, and analyzing that production to make the best decisions going forward. If you don't measure and have the data, and we've got a lot of very clear priorities that are going to come from the big data. You hear a lot about big data, but in agriculture, we've got USDA has a lot of data sets. We're trying to make those more publicly visible through graphic technology, through our dashboard, so everyone can have access to that to make better decisions as they go forward. And then, I'm from the old school of Vince Lombardi. If you don't have a scoreboard, if you don't keep score, you just practice it. We cannot afford just to practice in this going forward. If you're going to do right and feed everyone, you better keep a score in that area. So we're looking pretty good here by 2050. USDA 99 and hunger 0. So that's what we want to. That's where we want to be in 2050, and we want to smack them. We want food waste, food loss, and food waste. You know the statistics about that. Just think about it. If we could reduce food loss and food waste all the way from the field of what we leave there to the consumer's plates, what we're leaving there, it's amazing. We're so blessed in this country to have an ample supply of food. We've just taken it for granted, and frankly, folks, we're just wasteful about it. We cannot afford to do that if we're going to have the moral imperative of doing right and feeding everyone across this world. We've got to make this part of the discussion, and we're already developing champions to deal with us in the various sectors of convention areas and resorts and other places, and we're going to bring our retailers into this and make this a goal for all of us. Certainly, we want to do more with less. We believe that agriculture can be part of the solution, sequestering carbon rather than emitting carbon through the techniques that we know that work. And NRCS already has plans and goals and demonstrations of carbon sequestration. The good news about this is while we sequester carbon, it obviously improves soil health, which improves productivity. So farmers win by doing right, and they win by sequestering carbon using the farming techniques that help to keep that carbon in the soil, improving the productivity of those soils as well. Certainly from a water quality perspective, we know in a lot of places we've allowed nutrients to escape our fields. We're doing a better job there. We can do even better. And our goal is to reduce that nutrient runoff off of our fields and farms by 30% by 2050 in that way. And then again, we think farming can be a real contributor to our air quality through renewable energy. And we've seen that already through our ethanol and biofuels industry, but we think we can do more in that way by creating a better environment for renewable fuels, hopefully really moving forward with goals of 15% of our transportation fuel moving to that. So these are all important goals, but we're going to have a scoreboard that keeps track of these. We're not going to wait till the buzzer sounds at 0-0 because you know that it's progressive, and we're going to have really annual types of indications of trends of where we are in providing data to the industry and to the world to know that we're serious about this and serious about making these goals. By collecting more timely information that's useful to our customers, I think we can ensure that we're putting points on the scoreboard and making these kind of scores good as we go forward. Because why? We want to win. We want to win big. I mean, look at there. And it's exciting when you win. You celebrate when you win, right? And it's really important to win. And that's what we want to do as we go forward in winning for the world and doing right and feeding everyone as we go forward. So, you know, the challenges are meeting the food, fiber, fuel, feed, and environmental demands of the future is going to require some challenges. It's going to require all the things that we talk about. Innovation is the key, aligning the public and private sector as we go forward. And the real question is, will you join us? Will you commit yourself out there in your various sector, in your sphere of influence, to do the right thing of U.S. agricultural innovation agenda? And this is our mission, should you choose to accept it. Will you accept? Now, I would like to invite to the stage someone who has accepted that mission, and it is John Hartnett, who is quite an innovator and an investor here, and is going to talk. We're going to have a fireside chat here about the kind of innovation. He's a futurist in so many ways, and he's done a lot of things. And I want to invite John, join me up at the stage so we can have a conversation about the innovation imperative shaping the future of agriculture.
Thank you, Secretary.
As I indicated, John has accepted that challenge, that mission impossible of doing more with less. And John,
I feel I should have come out of the ceiling on a rope down here.
You missed the rope. We weren't quite secure. We didn't want you falling. So, but nonetheless, you're an innovative guy. Frankly, I read your bio, and it's pretty amazing what you've been involved in. I told John earlier, I don't know if you remember the Palm Pilot, but John was one of the early innovators in that area of the Palm Pilot and Handspring. And he was just delighted to know that I was a Palm Pilot user as we went forward. But he's leveraged those kind of technological skills and become interested in the food sector as well, knowing how important it is. So John, I appreciate you making the trip to really talk about the alignment of the private sector and the public sector as we go forward. You're the founder and CEO of SVG Ventures, an investment and technology firm, and you founded Thrive, which I had the opportunity to visit with you last year in California, a leading ag innovation, food innovation ecosystem comprised of the top food and technology systems, using that digitization that we talked about for doing more with less in very innovative kind of ways. So I know that's kind of your bio, but what do you really do, John?
Well, I've been in Silicon Valley for 22 years, and you might notice I don't have a Silicon Valley accent or a Californian accent. I'm actually originally from Ireland.
Yes.
And I want to get my agriculture credentials out early here because I don't want to be accused of being a tech city slicker here. I think at 8 and 9 and 10 years of age, I drove my first tractor. I baled hay in County Clare in Ireland, and I worked on a dairy when I was about 14 or 15. So my early years were in agriculture. That's where I got my big values.
Right.
But in Silicon Valley, you know, look, I had an opportunity to be there for the basically revolution of the smartphone. I think everybody in the room here today has a smartphone in their hand. It's changed their lives. But, you know, in the 90s, that didn't exist. And we had to kind of project forward to kind of say, okay, how will this happen? And we looked at some of the key trends in terms of connectivity and how that was going to project forward, driving costs down and kind of getting the size of computing to fit in your palm, and that was how they called the company. So we invented the smartphone and created about a $5 billion business from that over about 9 years. So that's kind of a big part of my background. And about 10 years ago, I'd set up SVG Ventures, and we set up an accelerator to be able to accelerate companies. So having been a CEO, having been a COO who has set up companies, companies don't happen easily. It's hard work, hiring a great team, building manufacturing, operations, distribution. So we took the approach to build an accelerator and bring key mentors around those companies to be able to help them, drive forward.
Birthing and getting them weaned is a challenge,
Yes.
right?
So I think that, that's kind of my early days. And, I got into the agriculture world really by accident. I think everybody knows Silicon Valley, but obviously California is one of the richest land in the world. Obviously a leader in the fresh food category and specialty crops. And even though Silicon Valley and Salinas Valley, you came here, last year, and it was phenomenal for you to come down and walk the fields and meet with Taylor Farms and also meet with the technology companies in Silicon Valley. But even though we were an hour apart, the world of agriculture and technology, we weren't communicating as best we should, and really trying to kind of align that was a big part of why we started to do this.
Well, that's really leads into my next question. You kind of heard the outline of the goals today of doing more with less, for using innovation and technology to get there. Talk to us a little bit about how that aligns with what you've already seen in the private sector and aligning with the public sector for these audacious goals of feeding 10 billion people by 2050.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, Secretary, I mean, these goals, I think they're bold, they're ambitious, but it's something that we need. This is probably the most important industry on the planet. It touches every family and every life on this planet. So this is probably the most important mission for all of us. And I think that alignment with entrepreneurs, my experience has been entrepreneurs can really change the world. They can bring new innovations, new technologies together. They can disrupt industries. And if you look at some of the sequence of events over the course of the last 20 years, whether it's either to do with fintech or entertainment or how you use information, this has all come from individuals and entrepreneurs that have actually done that. But the world of agriculture is not straightforward. It's a complex industry. Right. It's a complex supply chain. And I think having these goals really kind of set the bar, but I think really aligning the industry, aligning entrepreneurs, aligning innovators with the problems and understanding how they're going to solve those problems and use the technology and innovation to solve these problems. This is something that we did at Thrive, in California. We brought growers up from Silicon Valley or from Salinas Valley up to Silicon Valley and sat down and talked to the innovators about the problems that they have, around labor, food safety, water quality, water scarcity, etc. So I think the key thing is to enable innovation and to unleash innovation. You've got to direct it and focus it on the problems that you're most feeling the pain. And I think that will help drive a lot of the innovation going forward.
And I think that's a big change of what we at USDA have recognized, is that we've got to ask the right questions to solve the biggest challenges of agriculture. Now, what I'd like to hear your honest appraisal of, how does USDA do a better job as a neutral arbiter of not picking winners and losers, but facilitating the private sector research with where we need to go in that way, helping to synergize and synchronize both the production challenges out here, what are the best producers asking that needs to be solved next, and helping to align the research between both the public and the private sector. What role do you see USDA playing in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously a very critical role in terms of, there's a lot of innovation out there. I think over the last, 5-10 years, farmers are seeing more sensors, more applications, more data, more solutions, and I think there's somewhat confusion out there in terms of being able to understand what's the best technology I should be using to drive yield, to solve some of the challenges there. So I think guidance and education and putting a roadmap out there for farmers to really kind of understand and see what are the top technologies that they can apply. We just did our Thrive, top 50. We evaluated 3,500 startups from over 90 countries around the world.
You might want to take a little time and explain what Thrive is and how the competitive aspect of Thrive, almost like an agricultural food production Shark Tank type of thing. So.
Yeah. So we set up Thrive really as an accelerator to accelerate innovation to solve the problems of the agriculture sector. We also work with major growth stage startups that are, like companies like Plenty and AeroFarms, who are really kind of scaling on the controllable environment agriculture sector. And working with these entrepreneurs on one side, and then at the same side, we're working with farmers. So we're working with, Western growers, who are over 2,500, the largest farmers on the West Coast of the United States. We're working with the likes of Land O'Lakes across the Midwest, really to understand the challenges of the farmer. And then at the same time, we're working with probably about 3,500 startups and entrepreneurs that are solving these problems. So we're kind of sitting in the middle, and we've driven programs to address the problems with the farmers and also bring the community together. So, about 7 years ago, we founded the AgTech Summit with Forbes Media, and, you came to visit that last year. The whole idea about that was the Thrive, challenge was to bring the ecosystem together, bring farmers, researchers, innovators, entrepreneurs, corporate technology companies, so that we can get after these problems. So it's a combination of the foundation of what we're doing is the ecosystem and bringing that together, and then putting programs in place, whether it's either the programs around accelerating technology, identifying the problems of the farmer, and investing behind those as well. But we've worked very closely and carefully with the industry to identify these challenges.
Well, it sounds like you and STV Ventures and Thrive are really already doing what I've challenged all of us today to do, is to align the public and the private sector. You've gone to farmers, you've gone to taken the match with investors, and you match with technology and innovators, entrepreneurs of finding solutions that way. So that's what I hope to really add USDA as a public sector partner of facilitating more of that. What do you have specific recommendations of how we can engage? And as you know, you're not the only one. There's a lot of interest in Silicon Valley in the food sector now, a lot of investment and a lot of interest in, it's almost like after the technology revolution, they've kind of discovered the food industry and the food supply chain that really needs focusing.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think when investors and Silicon Valley, big companies look at this sector, the agri-food sector in the full supply chain is an $8 trillion industry. Yeah. When you look at some of those graphs that you talk about in terms of a growing population growing to 10 billion people, but also a changing consumer, 50% of the current population is Gen Z or millennials who are changing the way they're consuming and eating food. Yeah. And at the same time, you've got the challenges around water scarcity and all the challenges around labor, et cetera. So that gap, it's hard to keep doing what you're doing. You have to innovate. And I think that's where we've kind of focused is on the innovation in those areas. But then as we kicked into this, we have to get the entrepreneurs aligned with the problems. How we did that was we put a challenge out to entrepreneurs. So instead of a generic challenge and saying, hey, let's increase productivity by 50%, we're saying, okay, robotics automation is going to make this impact. Controlled environment is going to make this impact. Bioscience is going to make this impact. And digitization and data is going to make those impacts. So kind of breaking down the aspects of this, putting a challenge out to 5,000 entrepreneurs from around the world and getting them to kind of come up with the ideas, the innovation, and then pitch live on stage. 5 years ago, we brought entrepreneurs from around the world into the Western growers. It was a group like this, and the sharks on the stage were the farmers asking the tough questions in terms of how much is this going to cost me? Right. How is it going to improve my yield? So it's really kind of putting the entrepreneur and the farmer together and addressing those those challenges. And those kind of programs like the challenges, I think can be very, very impactful. So I think we need to go out to industry with these challenges that you've set the bar, and go out not just to industry in the United States, but worldwide. Right. There are countries around the world here like Israel. You visited Netherlands, earlier this year. I just came back from Australia yesterday. You look at countries, obviously Canada, Brazil. they have all the same challenges. They are innovating as well. How can we collaborate with those countries as well, and maybe get some of the best from some of these other countries to make us more competitive in what we're doing. So I think there's a combination of the global aspect, aligning the problems, and focusing on these. And I love what you've done here. I mean, having a scorecard, having it right up there, transparent with regard to this is the bar we're going for. We're going to hold a team accountable for this. This is the roadmap, and then we're going to measure this year by year and see how we're performing. I don't play American football, but I play soccer and rugby, and you can be on the field, but if you don't score goals, you're not winning.
Yeah, that's right.
And we've got to score those goals. So I think having that kind of a transparent view, I think, is going to be very, very important as we move forward here.
What you described as far as segmenting the focus of research, I didn't have time to get into it this morning, but that's exactly what we want to do with our USDA Agricultural Research Service, is really to identify the real challenges and problems. Where are the barriers? What are the limitations here? And deal with those things in various sectors. And I know Dr. Hutchins will be talking more to our industry as a whole about that, to do that as we go forward. So we look forward. That's a great strategy, and I hope you don't mind us copying that role. Now, I know probably what's on the mind, and my mind and the mind of many people out there. We want you to give us a peek into the future. You have a front row seat at some of these types of industries that are burgeoning out here and just developing, whether they're just sprouting out of the ground or whether they're growing good. And tell us what you see. What's the future of some of the exciting things that you think is going to help us meet some of these goals?
Yeah, I think if I look at it in a couple of ways. Obviously, we're looking at entrepreneurs and seeing the technology that they have. Venture capital is investing into the future, and where is venture capital going and placing the bets for the future in terms of technology. So when we did the analysis of where all these dollars are going in terms of venture capital, obviously biosciences is going to continue to drive the way in terms of doing more with less. But I think precision agriculture, I think, is going to step up in a really big way. I think investment in controlled environment agriculture, there's $1 billion already gone into this as a category from the private sector. So companies like Plenty and AeroFarms, for example, they've raised $600 million. They're no longer little startups. These companies are scaling. They're growing leafy greens. They're testing out berries today. And I see this as being a really interesting supplement to the challenge that we have. I don't see controlled environment and vertical farms as a competitive force. I do see it supplementing what we're doing, but I see that as a kind of a key path going forward. I also see that in terms of the supply chain itself, putting farms in the distribution center or vertical farms, I think is definitely going to be taking place in the next few years. Robotics automation has played a major role in what we're doing today. I think investment into this space, again, has the same level as it should be. I think this is an important area where we can drive automated vehicles there's nobody on the vehicle, and that they're actually driving and doing the weeding and the seeding and driving the solutions there. And I think that's what you're going to start seeing. There's companies, I think you met in Silicon Valley, a company called FarmWise and Blue River Technologies. These are some of the technologies that already exist, and I think they're going to scale.
Let me tell the audience about that. I didn't realize that this was one of the companies that you had helped to accelerate there, but we were in the Salinas Valley, and these two guys showed me this machine, whereas they'll put many, I believe it was cabbage there, many seeds in the row, and then you had labor come through there and thin out the most unproductive and a space there to leave hardy plants there at a regular space. Well, this machine autonomously went down the row. It had optics there that would choose the most healthy looking seedling that had come up there, inject some nutrients into that, and unfortunately for those weaklings, it put them out of their misery. And so that was what I saw autonomously saving, I think, about a crew of 25 laborers and doing it like 5 or 10 times faster.
Yeah.
So that was a great example that I saw right there, what innovation, sensor technology, optic technology can do, autonomously driven. That was pretty amazing.
I mean, one of the other things is, Driscoll berries, as you probably know, are driving robotics in the harvest automation, picking strawberries. It's going to be pretty amazing as you kind of see that kind of scale today. I think the other one is data. I mean, data is one of the issues that is out there. Data without AI and analytics is useless. At the same time, it's a challenge in terms of the trust and sharing that information. So I think this is going to play a key role in terms of the future. Secretary, I would say one thing that, when we were in the smartphone industry, when Apple announced they were coming into the iPhone, it was 2007. But the technology was around for 10 years beforehand. When the internet started, the technology was around for 20 years. So I don't think it's something that's going to be invented in the next couple of years that's going to be the big breakthrough. I think it's going to be adoption of the technology. Right. And I think, again, this is where the USDA can help farmers to adopt some of this technology. I also feel like some of the big players that are sitting on the sidelines today, a Google, an Amazon, and a Microsoft, they are starting to embrace this space. I think once they come in, I think it will really kind of put that inflection point, in there in terms of this productivity and attaining that productivity goal.
Right. You talked about something I want to go back to for a second, because traditional agriculturalists, traditional producers sometimes hear this gee whiz futuristic kind of thing and may feel threatened. You mentioned very specifically this will be an evolution there, and it's going to be complementary, not replacing. It won't disrupt to the point of through the adoption of these techniques that most people will move to. It's not going to disrupt a livelihood aside from helping them become better. So it's going to become complementary rather than desecrating.
Yeah, I guess if we look at vertical farming, why doesn't any farmer here have their own vertical farm? Why can't they run their farm in a supply chain as well? So I think you're going to see this change. Obviously, there's a couple of early players like Plenty and Air Farms driving this today. I think they're going to really set the bar and show the way. But does that become something that other farmers can deploy themselves? In the supply chain? I think it can be.
Yeah, with the local sourcing that consumers want today, and knowing where that came from, how it was grown, certainly that's part of it. The other thing I mentioned in my presentation was I'd love your advice and counsel on how USDA, from a regulatory perspective, can be aligned. We cannot lead the technological revolution there, but how can we make sure that regulations don't inhibit or hold it back in that way? It's a challenge here in USDA at DC to make sure our regulatory environment, the President's been very interested. In fact, I think the deregulatory environment that he's created has been almost as much a part of the economic boom that we're seeing here as tax policy. So people want to know, entrepreneurs want to know that you're not going to hold me back if I've got a great invention. So how do we do a better job aligning USDA regulatory issues with that? And I know one of the things we're dealing with right now is new breeding techniques. How do we do that in animals in that way?
Yeah, look, it's a very complicated and big challenge. I think regulation will slow down innovation. It will slow down the flow and the rate of what we're trying to do. At the same time, you need regulation. Like there's significant data out there, on people's businesses. Farmers need to be sure about what's going to be done with their information in terms of privacy. So I think that there's definitely a role here to make sure that there's regulation, but at the same time, this data could make us much more productive if it's actually interpreted and analyzed accordingly. So I think that balance, is very, very important. I think one of the areas that I would say, moving on in terms of how we could drive some of the innovation is, why can't we set up super farms in a couple of key locations across the United States and start to lead the world and kind of build clusters of excellence? Whether it's in Silicon Valley around digital and automation, whether it could be in Research Triangle or, various different locations. I think it's important for us to identify these key technologies, whether it's robotics, automation, controlled environment, on the biotechnology side, but set up areas of excellence where we can lead not just only research, but super farms, where we can bring entrepreneurs from all over the world, put their technologies into place, and demonstrate to us that this is going to reduce the cost, it's going to increase productivity, and also we can lead the world here. So I think there's an opportunity for us to kind of create super farms that can really demonstrate this. And obviously, with connectivity as a big issue and a major challenge for the industry, you know, it's very hard to enable technology without connectivity. I think, you know, a few weeks ago, I had my kids, we had the power outages in California with the fires, and my kids came to me, didn't realize that the lights were off, didn't realize the power was off, but the only thing they realized was there was no Wi-Fi.
That's right, yeah.
So,
Biggest challenge.
so if you think how important that is, I think in terms of every rural environment, I think this is, to me, in terms of mission, this is the biggest mission that we have. If we want to enable and light up the farms and enable and take one hand from behind the back of the farmers, we have to drive that, connectivity. And also maybe by having super farms where we can kind of showcase, 5G in some of these areas and show what the best of innovation can do. I think these could be great areas where we can actually drive this forward.
I think you've just given USDA a good idea here to create, certainly if we can put 5G in our NFL stadiums down there, we can put it in super farms in that way to do that. But I know that I did visit in North Dakota, and Governor Burgum, who had a career in Microsoft, they were creating a smart farm environment there and doing many of the things that you're talking about. But I love the terminology super farm, and I'd love for USDA to be facilitating that, going to Congress and saying, let's create some demonstration plots out here for the future, because those ideas coming out of Silicon Valley need to be proven in the field in some places.
That's right. As I say, I just came back from Australia. We were in Melbourne, and the Victorian government are really driving hard in terms of connectivity, in the locations there, and they've created an initiative, like this. They didn't call it a super farm, but the whole idea is to have kind of a farm of the future that, that has that. I think if you look at Canada today, they've kind of come out with these super clusters, whether it's around next generation foods and protein, next generation in terms of, data, next generation, automation and robotics. So I think we need to, we're leading the world already, but I think we need to be careful that we don't get complacent.
Certainly.
And I think, having this kind of a focus in terms of having these clusters aligned with challenges that are going out to the industry worldwide or out to entrepreneurs to say, solve this problem, increase productivity by 40%, reduce our footprint by 50%, and then breaking that out, putting the challenge out to every entrepreneur, bringing them over here and putting them on our super farms. And as these super farms demonstrate the future, let's bring that right across the United States, across the Midwest and across the West Coast.
And the ecosystem we have in the United States is very fertile for that. We've got obviously private sector research, public sector research that we're talking about trying to align. We've got entrepreneurial innovators and demonstration farms over that. But we also have an extension service that from our land-grant universities that's very good of getting the best and the best ideas and the most productive ideas out to a wide cross-section of people. So just like we were talking today, we know the things that can produce soil health over no-till and cover crops and those kind of things, but we don't have universal adoption yet there.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to get, the best ideas of how soil health. I happen to believe soil health may be one of those quantum leaps that we see as we understand more of the biology that's going on in the soil itself from a productivity. We've gained a lot over genetics, and we'll continue to do genetics improvements, but I think soil health is also a huge component.
Absolutely, and again, some of the technology is already there. There's, two young girls from Stanford University set up a company called Trace Genomics. And, they're 4 years old, the company is growing and scaling, and they're really focused on this area, and they're driving the whole area on soil health. So how can a company like that scale, and how can we get that adoption of their technology into the fields across the U.S.?
Well, John, you've challenged us. We want the globe to thrive by feeding everyone and doing while we're doing right. And I think your contribution there, we're delighted that you have focused in the food and agri-food sector and the supply chain there of helping us to accomplish some of these Go Bold goals that we have. And I look forward to a continuing relationship. We want to invite you to help us hold USDA accountable. And as you see things that could enable and facilitate the technological advances that will help us get there, I hope you'll feel free to help us do better.
Well, thank you very much, Secretary. It's an honor to be here. I know in my last 10 years, I've spent much more time in this industry, and I've been humbled by the industry, and I've been very passionate about this industry because it's really investing in our future. And when I look at our children, I look at our families, this is the industry that's going to make a difference to our world, to our health, and also to our families. So there's nothing more important than this industry, and that's why I'm really here and I'm motivated to make it happen.
Well, I think the producers in the audience today and across that hear this, I think would be very proud to hear you say that you've been humbled by the challenges and the complexities of production agriculture. That makes somebody like you that's on the cutting edge of innovation make us feel better out here.
It's easy kind of manufacturing a smartphone. It's difficult, producing food and bringing it through the most complex supply chain in the world.
In fact, some people even think it's easy farming, but we know it's not.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, everyone, we've got a little bit of a time for a break right now, so feel free to catch up with your favorite innovator out over coffee. We've got a great lineup for you coming back. Make sure you're back here at about 10:15. 10:15, we've got speakers from Iowa, Nebraska, Indiana, and also from the Food and Drug Administration. So thanks, everyone. Be back here at 10:15. So Scott, you got your...
Everybody, if you could please take your seat. Folks in the back could please come on in and take a seat. We're ready to begin with the next session of the program. So again, hope everybody enjoyed the break, got a refill on coffee, and is ready to go for this very exciting panel that we have next. Again, if people in the back could please have a seat, come on in, take your seat once again as we get ready to roll. It gives me great pleasure to introduce for our next panel, our moderator and facilitator of this next panel, and it's Dr. John Newton. Dr. Newton is Chief Economist for the American Farm Bureau Federation, the largest organization of independent farmers in the United States. In this role, Dr. Newton is responsible for the management of Farm Bureau's economics department and coordinates and conducts analysis used for the development and advocacy of Farm Bureau policy on the Hill. Prior to joining Farm Bureau, Newton was an agriculture economist for USDA, and was detailed to both the Senate Agriculture Committee and the USDA Office of the Chief Economist. Following his service to USDA and the Congressional Committee, Dr. Newton was an award-winning faculty member at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Newton is a Kentucky native and holds 2 masters and a PhD from The Ohio State University. Please welcome Dr. John Newton.
Good morning. That was terrible. Good morning. That's much better. I'm glad that the Deputy Secretary put the in there. We were trying to trademark that at my alma mater, but I don't think that was successful. But I'm John Newton. I'm the Chief Economist for American Farm Bureau Federation. We're the largest general farm organization in the country. We have nearly 6 million farmer and family farmer members across these United States. And I have the opportunity in my role as Chief Economist to travel the country and visit with farmers around the country and see firsthand the efforts of farmers and ranchers on innovation. And I'll tell you, when I visit with our farmer members across the country and when I visit with other farmers across the country, I'll tell you, farmers are more than folks that just play in the dirt. Farmers are meteorologists. They're entrepreneurs, they're risk takers, they're economists, they're scientists, financiers, veterinarians, inventors, and innovators. Those are the farmers that I engage with on a day-to-day basis. Farmers must reinvent themselves every year, reviewing the lessons of the past and adopting to ensure we never repeat past mistakes, and be better and more productive than we were the year before. Our dairy farmers and livestock producers innovate to improve efficiency, turn waste products into fuels, and to better care for our animals. And I think one of the places that we see that the most, and one of the most important conversations that agriculture's been having for the past year and a half is one around sustainability and one about climate change. And I think it's important to put into perspective where U.S. agriculture is in that conversation. Globally, agriculture contributes about 24 to 25% to greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 equivalent. In the United States, because of our innovative techniques, because of our technology adoption, whether you're using the economic sector measure or the IPCC measure from the United Nations, U.S. agriculture contributes about 8 to 9% of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. Some people talk about livestock and livestock's contributions to greenhouse gas in the United States. Maybe if you don't put milk in your coffee, you can reduce our greenhouse gas exposure. But if you look at dairy farms, for example, 0.6% is what dairy farms contribute to U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. The beef cattle sector contributes 1.95% to U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and the pork sector contributes less than 0.04% to U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Collectively, animal agriculture contributes less than 3% to U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and that's because of the productivity, the technology, and the innovation of American farmers, American livestock producers, and their agribusiness partners across the country, including the Department of Agriculture. Many people call the Farm Bill the first Green New Deal, and it's because of the efforts in the conservation title that we're able to achieve a lot of these goals. And if you look at each sector, look at the livestock sector on the beef side, if you measure as an index beef's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions per unit since 1990, when the EPA first started monitoring the greenhouse gas data, beef contributions are down 7%. Swine contributions are down 19%, nearly 20%. And the Secretary mentioned this morning the success of the dairy industry. They're down nearly 25% in terms of their contribution on a per unit basis to greenhouse gas emissions in the United States over the last 30 years. And that's because of the innovative techniques, technologies, increased productivity of the dairy farms. All of that contributes to Ag's successful innovation story. And I think one of the more and most successful parts of that innovation story we can find when we look at our row crop sector. if we look at corn, in 2018, 81 million acres of corn were harvested. In 1990, we would have needed 121 million acres to produce the same amount of corn. So we were 40 million acres more efficient in corn production in 2018 than when we were 30 years prior. On cotton, we were 4 million acres more efficient. Soybeans, 42 million acres more efficient. And on wheat, 8 million acres more efficient. Combined, nearly 100 million acres more efficient in crop production than where we were 30 years ago. That's because of precision agriculture. That's because of innovation. Today, the Secretary announced the Agriculture Innovation Agenda, which includes a goal, and you got to go big or go home. It includes a goal of increasing U.S. agricultural productivity by 40%, while cutting the environmental footprint of U.S. agriculture by 50% by 2050. To do that, we must be innovative, and we've got 4 excellent panelists today to share their stories of innovation. We have Jeff Broin, the founder and CEO of POET, Frank Yiannas, the Deputy Commissioner of Food Policy and Response at the FDA, Bruce Kettler, who I just recently found out is the Ohio State University, we'll forgive those Purdue and Indiana ties there, Director of the Indiana State Department of Agriculture, and then we have Sherry Rogge Fiddler, President of the Farm Foundation. Those are our 4 panelists today, and they're going to talk about biofuels, climate change, rural viability, innovation in agriculture as a solution, and digitation, food safety, and traceability. Our first speaker today is Jeff Broin, the founder and CEO of POET. Jeff is the founder and CEO of POET, the world's largest producer of biofuels. POET currently operates 27 bioprocessing plants with a combined annual production capacity of 2 billion gallons of ethanol, reducing carbon emissions and improving air quality nationwide. For the past 3 decades, Broin's mission to meet the needs of the world through agriculture rather than fossil fuels has grown the biofuels industry while increasing grain demand in rural America, stimulating international economic growth and positioning agriculture to be a leading solution to the climate crisis. Please join me in welcoming Jeff to the stage.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here today to talk to you a bit about something really big. Today we're going to talk about the planet Earth. What you see up here on the screen is a timeline of the history of the planet. It shows the past, the present, and the future. Let's take a look at the past. So how do we sustain ourselves for tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years on the planet Earth? Well, it's pretty simple. Plants grew on the planet Earth, animals consumed the plants, people consumed the plants and the animals. Eventually we even had row crop agriculture using the animals to till the land. And the waste from the animals went back to the earth as fertilizer, and the waste from the plants. And the dead matter went into the earth and became crude oil. I believe God made the earth to hold unlimited amounts of carbon. Unlimited, think about that. He made the earth to hold unlimited amounts of carbon. So in the past, everything was in balance on the surface of the planet Earth. Then came the next era, the era of oil. In the timeline of mankind, this timeline is probably as wide as your fingernail. It hasn't been that long. 150 years and hundreds of thousands of years, we've had the era of oil. So we began taking that dead matter back out of the soil, out of the earth, extracted about 50 million years of it over 150 years and blew it up into the environment. Anybody think that's just a little bit out of sync? Maybe 50 million years, 150 years? Yeah, probably a little bit out of sync. This has caused enormous environmental damage. Today, more than 20,000 species of plants, animals, and bacteria are going extinct every year. There's only 9 million on the planet. A recent University of Arizona study, in fact, was in the paper last week, showed that 1/3 of plant and animal life will be gone in 50 years. Permanently gone. You can't get it back. how long before we have catastrophic consequences from our choice to pull dead matter out of the earth? How long can we wait to make a change? So what has to happen in the future to fix this problem we created? Well, I feel there's only one choice. We need to return to our roots, literally. We need to stop extracting oil from the earth. It's going to take time, but it's got to start now. And we need to return to agriculture. In the future, I believe ag will provide the food, fuel, and fiber to sustain all life on our planet. It's a little-known fact that starch and cellulose, which my company processes, are the building blocks of almost everything that come from a barrel of oil. And the byproduct is food. Protein, oil, and micronutrients we can use to feed people all over the planet. And the more we make, the lower the price gets for the food. So you're all thinking, will it cost more? Is it going to cost more to make it out of agriculture instead of oil? Well, not necessarily. Today, biofuels are significantly cheaper than the oil that they replace, and that's with zero subsidies. In fact, oil still carries some subsidies. We have none. So why does this happen? Because oil prices have increased exponentially in the last few decades, while commodity prices have stayed pretty much the same due to increasing yields. And I believe that will continue in the future. We'll continue to have higher and higher yields and very competitively priced commodities, while oil, which is running out, will get more expensive. So the opportunity is here and the time is now. In my opinion, the only way to avoid the catastrophic consequences of climate change is to return to agriculture. Now here's another thing you're not thinking about. Biofuels will need to be a catalyst for profitable, sustainable agriculture. What was the most profitable time in agriculture in the last 50 years? When biofuels saw explosive growth, we tightened up worldwide commodity supplies, and prices went up. Farmers need a profit to invest in the technology of sustainability. We can't expect them to lose money and invest in sustainability. So biofuels will need to grow to bring worldwide prices up. If we'd have moved from E10 to E15 7 to 8 years ago, which should have happened, commodity prices would not be where they are today. They'd be much higher. Of course, we've been fighting a lot of battles, of course, against our opponents to get there. You would not believe the battles. I'll show you a book on the history of it if you want to see it. It's been a tough, tough road. And the 30% increase in biofuels by 2050 announced by Secretary Perdue today will play a key role. You see, we simply can't eat what we produce, and we never could. Are you all aware that a recent Stanford study a few years ago showed that 1 billion acres went out of production while the U.S. and Europe subsidized grain for 50 years? 1 billion acres went out of production. The agricultural capacity of the world is virtually untapped, and nobody seems to know it. Virtually untapped. Let's look at our other demand sources. Exports really haven't changed in the U.S. in more than 30 years. In addition, other countries around the world are producing more and cheaper grain. So what's the opportunity for U.S. agriculture? How about we process our crops right here into higher value biofuels and bioproducts and export those around the world? In fact, that's what my company does, and we can do a lot more of it. And what else can we export with it? Protein, oil, and micronutrients, which will get cheaper. I've been to Africa numerous times. Those kids that don't grow hair in Africa, it's because they don't have enough protein. Let's lower the price of it and send it to them as a byproduct. Everyone in this room needs to tell the story that farmers don't just produce food. They produce food, fuel, and fiber. They've already been doing it for decades. I've been in the business 32 years of taking starch and turning it into biofuel and shipping the byproducts all over the world. We produce 2 billion gallons of clean burning fuel, 10 billion pounds of high protein products that go around the world, and 500 million pounds of corn oil that becomes biodiesel. That's biofuels as a byproduct of biofuels. How's that for cool? Biofuels, is anybody thinking about that? It's exciting. It's very exciting. It's very exciting. So you might ask, how can agriculture replace oil? Well, I mentioned the ag potential of the world is virtually untapped. I'll give you an example. So we actually created a nonprofit that works in Africa, in Kenya specifically. We're working with 160,000 farmers in Africa right now. We can increase their yields by 400 to 900% on every crop they raise, including their trees, for avocados and mangoes. And we can do it in 2 years. And in 4 years, we can walk away and it's self-sustainable, because they all go from starving and not being able to feed their own family to having surplus and being able to sell. So if you look just at the continent of Africa alone, we could bury the world in commodities for 30 to 50 years. All we have to do is teach them how to do it, help them with some infrastructure, and create the products that can replace oil. That says nothing of India, South America, China, and others who are not using their land to the fullest. And remember, there's 1 billion acres out there that we set aside that hasn't come back into production while the U.S. and Europe were subsidizing grain. So the agricultural potential of the world is huge. And I just don't think the world understands that. But we should tell the story. We all need to tell the story. I believe we need to tap the power of the earth through agriculture to solve the climate crisis. Ag isn't the problem. You just saw some data on that a minute ago. Ag is the solution. What will it take to get the message out there? It'll take all of us working together. Ag isn't famous for working together. In fact, we're pretty bad at it. We need farmers, ag companies, ag organizations, biofuel producers, biofuel organizations, food companies, the USDA, maybe our president, sustainability drivers like Patagonia, Culver's, and people who are super interested in agriculture. I know them. They're very excited about these agendas for agriculture. And everyone we can convince to tell the agriculture climate change story. We need to tell the world we are the only short-term major solution to climate change, because that's true if you look at the data. The only short-term solution to climate change. We'll need to fight an oil industry that's well entrenched, and they'll spend a lot of money to stop us. But I believe we can win. It is critical that we win, because failure isn't an option. If we succeed, we may literally save the earth and restore a healthy planet for future generations. What kind of world do you want to leave behind for your children and grandchildren? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I think a couple things that you mentioned really stand out. Economic sustainability and the fact that agriculture can be part of the solution. So thank you very much for those remarks. Our second speaker is Frank Yiannas, Deputy Commissioner of Food Policy and Response at the Food and Drug Administration. He's the principal advisor to the FDA Commissioner on Food Safety Policies, including implementation of the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act. His leadership role covers a broad spectrum, such as outbreak response, traceback investigation, product recall activities, and supply chain innovation. Mr. Yiannas came to the FDA from leadership roles with Walmart and the Walt Disney Company. He has long been recognized for his role in elevating food safety standards and building food safety management systems based on science and risk. Please join me in welcoming Frank to the stage.
Well, good morning. It's good to see each and every one of you, and I'm delighted to be part of this conversation about the role of innovation in agriculture and food production, a topic that's near and dear to my heart. As you heard by the way of the intro, fairly new to the federal government. I arrived at FDA in December of 2018, a little bit over a year ago. And prior to that, I spent 30 years in the private sector. I spent the first 20 years of my career working for the Disney Company, where I oversaw safety and health, including food issues. Past 10 years, I was at Walmart, where I was the Global VP of Food Safety. And now for a little bit over a year, I'm the Deputy Commissioner of Food Policy and Response at FDA. So I like to joke I went from the happiest place on earth, the Disney Company, to the busiest place on earth, the Walmart Company. And now I'm at the, and I'll let you fill in the blank. I saw some of those mouths moving. I didn't like what I heard. I actually think it's one of the most prestigious regulatory agencies on earth, and I'm delighted to be here. Yeah, I'm with FDA, not USDA. When I was in the private sector, I thought, well, USDA and FDA don't work together. But I can tell you, having been in that role and because of the strong leadership of Secretary Perdue and our Commissioner, Dr. Stephen Hahn, and because the American people expect their government to work together, the USDA and FDA are working together better than ever. But even before I joined government, one of the things that was really clear to me, sitting atop of the world's largest retailer, was that innovation was needed for food. And in particular, the one that I'm really interested in today, and the one that I'll share with you, is digitalizing or digitizing the food system. And I'll share 2 use cases just for illustration to allow you to imagine. I think digitalizing the food system is critical because I believe we can create a safer, smarter, more efficient, and sustainable food system. And we have to. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Now, just like the previous speaker that gave a bit of a history lesson, I like to think of myself as a food safety futurist. And so any good futurist knows that they have to understand and learn from the past. I love history. And so what I'm going to try to do, if you permit me, I'm going to give you the history of food production and food processing in one slide in about 60 seconds. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. At the beginning of time, man, and I use the term man affectionately, ladies, to refer to both genders, men and women would eat food quickly, say, here, eat it before it spoils, because they were going out and hunting and gathering food. Fast forward over time, humans said that food spoils fast, here, let's salt it. And we have literally in the literature our first hint of early preservation techniques. After a period of eating salty food apparently for a long, long time, humans said, hey, that salt tastes bad. Here, let's put that food on ice, another form of preservation. Humans then said that ice melts fast. Here, let's place that food in a refrigerator. Now, they're not the type of GE refrigerators that you and I have at home, but they were wooden blocks that contain blocks of ice for preservation. Around 1864, the science begins to evolve with the work of one of my heroes, Louis Pasteur. That food still spoils. Here, let's pasteurize it, and food can last longer and it can be safer. 1980, scientists tell us that pasteurized food doesn't last long enough. Here, let's irradiate it. We can now have shelf-stable foods for 50, 60, 70 years. Sounds yummy. 1997, we start hear from some consumer groups that say that irradiated food is bad for you. Here, eat this all-natural fresh stuff. And at the turn of the century, this is what we're hearing, that all-natural fresh stuff goes bad. Here, eat this food quickly before it spoils. That's all you need to know about the history of food. And clearly, it's intended to be a bit humorous and you laugh, but there's a lot of truth to that, isn't it? The pressure that's being placed on food producers and farmers is saying we want naturally processed, minimally processed, and forgetting some of the lessons we've learned from the past, such as consumers' renewed interest in drinking unpasteurized milk and the lessons forgotten about pasteurization. So you can see in some ways we've come full circle. And while the slide is intended to be humorous, I want to pause on a more serious note. I genuinely believe that the way forward is not going back to some type of romanticized idea of how good things used to be. But I think it's this march of continued improvement that you've heard outlined here this morning with innovation, technology, and change. The reality is the food system has always been changing. We talked about hunter-gatherer. You heard earlier today about domestication of plants and animals and early farming techniques, generally around rivers. If you fast forward to the early 1900s, what did you have? The industrial farming revolution, with more farmers able to produce more food than ever before to feed a growing population and letting people specialize in other professions. A mere 100 years ago, a lot of the people in society would have been involved in food production, and that's not so today. And so the food system is changing, and it continues to change. In the 1980s, the typical grocery store had about 15,000 food products, food SKUs. How many food items do you think your typical grocery store has today? Anybody want to guess? I heard 60,000, close, 50,000. A supercenter could have up to 75,000 food items. I know sometimes I hear people very critical about the food system. What a terrible food system. I think today's food system is pretty marvelous. Are there opportunities for improvement? Yes. But imagine being an individual that was living in the 1500s or the 1600s and getting in a time machine and fast forwarding it to time and walking into our grocery store today. You think they'd say, what a terrible food system? They'd be in awe. They'd say, you live better than kings and queens. Thousands of different food products, fresh, seasonally available, foods from all over the world, available to you for a fraction of your hard-earned dollar. That's the great work that all of you have done. But that doesn't mean that we can't do better. And where are we going? I like to think about it the endless shelf. I've seen the tsunami coming of online conversion and you no longer needing brick and mortar, and this concept of omni-channel where you can get online, order anything you want from anywhere at any time. Maybe at your fingertips, a million SKUs. That's the world that we're living in. Research suggests that by the year 2023, it's right around the corner, 1 out of every $5 spent on food in this country will be spent on online platforms. There's a tsunami coming of how consumers are going to shop. That's the equivalent of thousands of grocery stores popping up all over the country because of online conversion. And there are more changes coming. I believe, let me see if you believe this too, I believe we're in the midst of a food revolution. How many of you believe we're in the midst of a food revolution? If so, raise your hands. Quite a few hands going up. Listen to, I think there's going to be more changes personally in the next 10 years. I'll predict this. Not a big better, but I'd almost bet it. I bet we see more changes in food in the next 10 years than we have in the past 30. Anybody want to take me up on that bet? Listen to this. Products will be reformulated. They're being reformulated. New food sources and production approaches will be realized. They're being realized. And the food system will increasingly become digitized. And I believe, and what you've heard this morning, is that to succeed in these modern times, we're going to need more modern approaches. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. That's why at the agency, FDA, we announced in April of last year that we were going to be embarking on an initiative called a new era of smarter food safety. We'll very soon be releasing a blueprint, and we'll outline how the agency will plan to oversee food safety for the next decade. But it will strongly emphasize the use of new and emerging technologies. The goal is to create a more digital, traceable, and smarter food system. What is smarter food safety? It's a new approach, a mindset, thinking about the problems differently, leveraging all of the technologies that are existing in society and used by business sectors all around us to provide efficiencies and improve predictive capabilities. They'll include some of the technologies that you'll hear today, blockchain technology, sensors, you've already heard about that, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. When you look at other industries or tracking, let's say airplanes, for example, ride sharing or packages that you order online, we can do this with food. We can create what I refer to as the equivalent of FedEx tracking for food, and that will be good for the food system. Let me tell you why, because the why really matters. Why is a digital and traceable food system important? The why informs how we act. Foodborne illness. While by and large, I think the food system today is pretty safe, there's still too much foodborne illness, and we believe that one foodborne illness outbreak is one too many. 1 in every 6 Americans will experience a foodborne illness every year. About 48 million Americans. The cost is up into the $98 billion annually lost to the U.S. economy. A digital and transparent food system could allow us to have a safer food system. Imagine small reductions in food safety will achieve or deliver hundreds of millions of dollars to the U.S. economy. That's a good reason. How about traceability? How many of you remember, here's a picture of the spinach outbreak that occurred in 2006. There are more recent outbreaks. What happened? Bagged spinach associated with E. coli 157H7. FDA says we know there's an association, but we don't know what brand of salad or spinach it was. What do we have to do? We have to go out with a broad consumer advisory and say Americans avoid bagged spinach. Basically, all bags of spinach wiped from all grocery store and restaurants across the nation. Sweeping measure. Takes 2 weeks to trace that to source. When it's all said and done, it was one producer, 1 day's production, one lot number. The damage that that did to farmers that were unnecessarily implicated is hard to measure. And the damage that that did to consumer trust is hard to measure. And some reports and studies suggested that it was years, 6, 8, 10 years before the spinach industry ever fully recovered. Food fraud. Do you think a digital transparent food system could deter food fraud? How many of you heard this? There's more organic food sold in the world than is produced in the world. How many of you buy organic? I just by a show of hands. Just make sure it's true. Just make sure it's true. How about the horse meat scandal in the UK a few years ago? Remember that? Horse meat prices were down, beef prices high, they had a glut of horse meat. Some unscrupulous suppliers decided, well, we'll just substitute horse meat instead of beef. Consumers were going to the grocery store buying what they thought was 100% beef lasagna, and guess what? There was no beef in it whatsoever. Do you think a digital transparent food system that can trace back to a fraudster's door would be good? Absolutely, it would be good. Regulatory requirements, no need to be doing this on paper. Food waste, you've heard that a couple times today. I worked in retail, so I like to think of it this way. Imagine going into your favorite grocery store, buying 3 bags of grocery, and as you walk out of the grocery store, you take one of those bags of grocery and you throw it in the garbage can. That sound ridiculous? Sounds really ridiculous. Some of you are saying, you're crazy. But that is, in essence, what's happening every day across the land. And I've seen how these digital tools and learning by working at a very large supply chain that had pretty good supply chain logistics, how small tweaks and improvements can make dramatic benefits and allow you to flow food and reduce waste. And then lastly, the consumer is asking for this. Consumer expectations are changing. I worked at a discount retailer for 10 years. I will tell you, consumer expectations at the beginning of my tenure were drastically different than at the end of my tenure. Even in a discount retailer, consumers wanted to know more about that food, how it was produced, and where did it come from. And so hopefully I've convinced you the why. We'll be outlining the work that we're going to be doing to create this new digital transparent food system under what we're calling a new era of smarter food safety. And in the time I have remaining, I just want to give you 2 examples to illustrate what I mean. You can see those are the 4 focus areas: tech-enabled traceability, smarter tools for prevention, new business models as food system changes, and retail modernization and food safety culture. But let me talk about the 2 that I want to, which is tech-enabled traceability and new tools for prevention. In terms of tech-enabled traceability, I'll tell you why. Here's another example of why it's important. How many of you remember just this past Thanksgiving and the Thanksgiving before that, the romaine scares? In 2018, there was a scare, and the CDC and FDA advised consumers to avoid romaine, regardless of where it was grown, because we couldn't tell where those illnesses were coming from. Again, the damage of that trust is pretty important. Unfortunately, last Thanksgiving, there was another outbreak. There was progress made in that 1 year. The advisory in 2019 wasn't to avoid romaine lettuce from all over the country. It was more narrow in scope. That was based on good work done by some state health departments. The role that states play in ag and food is critical. But we had some firms, one retailer and manufacturer in particular, starting to adopt tech-enabled traceability. And that allowed us to trace it back to Salinas, California, so the advisory was limited. But you can fast forward into the future and say, if these tools become more abundant, we could trace back to source with precision and identify maybe it came from a particular ranch or a particular farm. When I was in the private sector a couple of years ago, I'm going to illustrate how this looks and how it adds value. I did a proof of concept, what I refer to as the life of the mango. I'll go through this pretty quickly. But I wanted to see if this new and emerging technology called blockchain could play a role in traceability. I'd been pursuing the holy grail of traceability for a long time. This is the life of a mango. Mango seedlings get planted generally in small farms in Central and South America. It takes about 6 to 8 years for those mango seedlings to produce fruit. The mango trees are bearing fruit and they're ripe. Farm crews come out, pick the mangoes, take them to a packing house. They get washed, treated, boxed, shipped by airline and sea to the United States. You can see in this example, those mangoes were further sliced and placed in clamshells. They were then sent to 40-plus distribution centers across the United States and eventually made their way to 6,000 retail outlets. Pretty complicated journey. I wanted to know, how does traceability work? The world's largest retailer with very modern supply chains. I took a package of sliced mangoes, literally came into one of my staff meetings, put it on the center of the conference room table, and I said, trace back study starts right now. Trace these mangoes back to source. How long do you think it took the world's largest company to trace those mangoes back to source? Anybody want to guess? 6 days, 18 hours, and 26 minutes. 7 days. And they're supposed to be good at it. We then started working to capture that information in very simple fashion on the blockchain, reran the study, scanned the packed mangoes, was able to trace back to source in 2.2 seconds. That's food traceability at the speed of thought. Now, what does that mean? It's what it means it's really important. If there's a food scare, you don't have to pull all those mangoes. You can identify what was the problem. The other thing that we learned was the benefit to freshness was important because we started lighting up the supply chain and having better data than we ever had before. And we found out that it was 2 to 3 days to get across the U.S. Customs border. And for every day of shelf life or removed from that border crossing, that's a day of shelf life you give back to the consumer. That could also change how many of you buy these mangoes. They're generally not too ripe because they pick them when they're not quite ripe because they're concerned about shelf life. And so you could even optimize so that you have a fresher product. I'm persuaded that there's a strong public health and business case for better traceability. Let me close with another use case. But let me go back and say, that example that I gave you, it's not about blockchain. I believe in blockchain technology because if you understand how it works, it's a decentralized and distributed digital ledger. And the food system is a decentralized and distributed food system. It's going to be hard to get everybody in the food system in a centralized database, so it's different. But it's not about blockchain. It's about better traceability and smarter supply chains. The other example I'll give you, and then I'll close, is AI. AI sounds like it's sexy and people are chasing the shiny coin. We're not. Imports in the United States, Americans expect their food to be safe, whether it's imported or domestically produced. What percentage of the food do you think Americans eat is imported from abroad? Smart group of people here. It's not as high as people think. It's 15%, our estimations. It's much higher in some commodities. Seafood, we estimate that about 94% of seafood consumed in this country is imported. That one's really high. So we did a proof of concept using a technology tool that we've used that's been pretty good, Predict, that ranks import lines, and then we then pull samples and we analyzed them to see if they're violative, they meet U.S. standards. We added on some functionality of machine learning onto an existing tool, looking back at 2 years of data retrospectively to see if it improved. And what do you think happened? It dramatically improved our capability of finding violative products. Not very hard, but you heard earlier today, there's a lot of data. And the human mind just can't comprehend that, neither can old school traditional statistical techniques. But some of these new tools can. And so imagine all of these million lines of food shipments coming into the country, those containers. Imagine having a tool that let's say, increase your predictive capabilities by hundreds and hundreds of % to say, that's the container you should look at. That's the container that has the violative food product. That's what we're talking about. Let me close with this. I hope I persuaded you that digitizing is really important. But what I want you to think about is not what about. I want you to think about, well, what if? I want you to close with just imagining. Imagine how different our work and your work could be if we use some of these tools to make work and lives better. Imagine this. Imagine knowing the potential of weather impacts from places affected, let's say, by hurricanes or floods that may be hundreds of miles away because we're leveraging big data analytics. Imagine sitting here in this room, being concerned about water quality being used on your farm or in your food production facility and saying, no, I feel good about it, because on your handheld device, you're looking at some type of feed from sensor technology and saying, my water quality is under control. Imagine having greater confidence in the food that's being provided by you or to you in your supply chain, because somebody in your organization is using a tool like AI to dramatically increase your predictive capabilities. Or imagine going into a grocery store, buying a bag of salad and scanning it and knowing where it came from with certainty. What we're talking about this morning aren't things that can't be done. They're already being done. We just need to use them. We're talking about innovations to create a safer, smarter, and more sustainable food system. We can do this. No, we will do this, and we will do this together. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Frank. That was a very, very exciting presentation. Our next panelist is Bruce Kettler, Director of Indiana State Department of Agriculture. Bruce Kettler is appointed by Governor Eric Holcomb on January 8th, 2018. Bruce was appointed to Governor Holcomb's cabinet in December of 2019. He also serves as the Director of Agribusiness Development for the Indiana Economic Development Corporation and reports directly to Lieutenant Governor Suzanne Crouch. Prior to joining Indiana State Department of Agriculture, as I indicated earlier, he was a Buckeye, but Bruce worked as the Director of Public Relations for Beck's Hybrids and brings to the department over 30 years of agricultural leadership experience and knowledge that spans from production agriculture and sales to community and industry relations. Please join me in welcoming Bruce to the stage.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. So I'm here from state government, and so not only did he blow my credibility by being a Buckeye, I suppose, now I say I'm from state government, try to make that even better, I guess. But thank you. It's an honor to be here. I certainly look forward to learning, along with all of you, about a lot of things that are happening. And the theme of the innovation imperative is just really intriguing to me. Not as much the innovation part, but the imperative. And I think that we're hearing a lot of work around how imperative and how important the work that we're going to be doing is important. And a lot of people might say, why should someone from a State Department of Agriculture be part of this conversation? Aren't you folks like stifling innovation and real slow and stodgy? And well, maybe there is some of that. I think that there is probably some of that. But I think it's also important for us to understand that there's a lot of folks involved. And I want to start with this thought that no individual sector within what we do in the industry of agriculture operates in this vacuum. It might be the public and private sector working together. It might be that we've got rural and urban. We know that there's a lot of things changing with the food system around that. I think we need to understand that farmers, the agribusinesses that support them, and then the rural communities and the consumers where they are, wherever they might be, also are part of this. In fact, you can probably take each of those individual circles and put circles within them because it becomes pretty complex pretty quickly. And so no one operates in a vacuum, and there's a lot of interdependence that happens when we think about where we are with that. Real quickly, I just want to start with our department as the State Department of Agriculture. These are the 5 divisions that we operate in. I'm going to spend just a few minutes on several of them talking about how we look from an innovation standpoint in what we do. The reason I throw this up here is as the State Department of Agriculture, we're organized, quite frankly, differently than most of my counterparts in their departments across the United States, in that we do not have a significant regulatory function within our department. With the exception of the Indiana Grain Buyers and Warehouse Licensing Agency, the rest of the regulatory functions within our state that affect agriculture are within different departments around there. So I start with that to say that what we look to do is to focus on a couple of areas that we're looking at. And really, it's about how we participate in the process and how we make sure that we're looking from an innovative standpoint to be able to make that and improve that. I want to start with that public affairs piece. Really, it's about advocating or making sure that we help a lot of people understand what agriculture is about, what agriculture does, and what it's for. It was mentioned earlier this morning, I think, by Secretary Perdue. We really don't tend to be very good at telling what we do, whether it's on the farm or even within the ag businesses and people that help assist with that. So from a policy standpoint, we look not only federally, obviously from a state perspective within the department, but we also get involved in local efforts to try to make sure that we're working on the right things that farmers and people involved in that process want us to work on. Really, it's about us helping to provide guidance and awareness to each of those sectors. So we'll work with our legislators that are here in Washington, D.C. We'll help work on local policy sometime to make that happen. Really what it amounts to is sometimes we find ourselves, because we don't have that significant regulatory function, we very often find ourselves as a policy broker. I'll give you an example. When the folks that are regulated, let's say a confined feeding operation, very often they may have, they want to understand what they're to operate under, but they may not want to go to the regulator, the regulating agency, to start to talk, to have those conversations. Well, as an agency, we can help with that and do help with that on a pretty regular basis, and sometimes even between state agencies like our Department of Environmental Management, Department of Natural Resources. There are areas that affect our farmers, and we often play that policy broker. Then the other area, of course, is simply from a communications, whether it's public relations, use of our social media channels, we get involved in advocating. The next area is youth leadership and workforce development. Some folks might say, does this really have anything to do with innovation in agriculture? I would argue it's really, really important. And we do get involved in it. You may have noticed on that slide, the State FFA Association in Indiana actually is housed within our department. And so we look from an agriculture education standpoint, the classroom piece, if you will, to the State FFA Association, and we have the leadership within our department, and it just presents a lot of really unique opportunities. For example, one of our staff members who focuses on the ag education piece really is embedded almost every day with the governor's workforce cabinet and folks involved in state education. She really brings a unique perspective to help them understand what are the future jobs going to look like. What are the skills that are needed in the future in the industry of agriculture so that as a state we know and understand what we need to work toward? What do we want to have happen? And starting in our high schools and junior high schools and working up through post-secondary education. Another example, we had a trade mission. Lieutenant Governor and I took a trade mission to outside of the United States last fall. And we took the FFA organization with us to help talk about agriculture education, youth leadership development, and why that's important not only to our state but to our country. And it was really interesting, the conversations that were had with people in other governments outside of the United States to make that happen. You'll notice in the upper corner, I mentioned AgriNovus Indiana. This is an organization that is focused on the ag biosciences. John knows them very well and has been very helpful with a lot of things. AgriNovus Indiana has been formed to focus on that area. But a lot of what they do, besides trying to make sure that the ag bioscience sector within our state is growing and it's functional and we have the workforce there to make it happen, one of the things that they do and they're working on is trying to help people understand in what I would call the non-traditional areas, maybe outside, for example, of our land-grant universities, why there's a good opportunity in agriculture to be able to participate in these sciences. For example, Rose-Hulman is a university in Indiana, well-known, really worldwide for its engineering school. We probably aren't doing a lot to talk to Rose-Hulman about the engineering capabilities in food and ag and biosciences to the students at Rose-Hulman and their parents. And they've got AgriNovus is building a tool called Field Atlas that is really going to help students and parents at the high school and even younger age know and understand that. Next area, soil conservation and water. We've heard a lot this morning already about how important this will be. In Indiana, we reside really in two major watersheds. Of course, the Mississippi River watershed or basin and the Western Lake Erie Basin. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard over the last several years about Lake Erie and the problems and issues and things that are going on. A good part of the northeast part of Indiana resides in that basin as well. So soil conservation, clean water is really important to our farmers and to be able to make sure that they're doing what they need to do. The approach that we've taken on this is really a partnership approach. You'll notice that I've got listed on there a couple of agencies from USDA at the federal level, NRCS, Farm Service Agency. Then we also work with the local soil and water conservation districts. So the approach is truly a partnership. We have formalized this partnership in what we call the Indiana Conservation Partnership. Really, it's trying to look statewide, not just within water basins or within one basin or the other, but we're looking statewide. And the idea is that a landowner and a farmer, they don't care if it's the federal government, the state government, or even a local soil and water conservation district that is there to help them. In fact, many times, and very often, they have to work together to be able to help them accomplish some of the practices that they want to put on there. So we have formalized this partnership. I mentioned that it's statewide, and more importantly, this partnership has brought in the commodity groups on the crop side, it's brought in the livestock groups, and we've even brought in the Nature Conservancy into this partnership, for example, and to take a holistic approach at what needs to be done and make sure that we're doing the right things, and we want to have that. So not only are we doing that, I throw up some information from this partnership. This is 2018 data. We don't have 2019 quite finished yet. But you'll notice that this partnership in 2018 implemented over 22,000 practices on farms and lands in the state of Indiana. And you can see the information there on the side by the graphic about what we accomplished in that 1 year alone. Almost 2.8 billion pounds of sediment that did not flow into the waters in the state of Indiana. So again, if we work together, and we keep in mind that landowners and farmers really don't care whether it's federal, state, or local that's working on it, but if we're working together and we align that, we make that happen. The other thing we're finding is this alignment really helps from a private sector perspective. We hear a lot about sustainability. Well, we all know that everybody has their own definition of sustainability. But if we can start to show data and information about what we're doing, how we're affecting it, it really helps to line those efforts up from the private sector and even non-governmental organizations. The soil health aspects start to become an important part of the conversation, and we make sure that is done. So we're aligning those folks up, we're getting them together, and making sure that they understand that this is just not something that only farmers or only landowners are out there on their own. Rural economic viability. This, to me, whether we think about farms, ag businesses, rural communities, this is a really important part to me. And very often it gets ignored, I believe. So part of what we're trying to do as a State Department of Agriculture is find ways to look at how we view our rural communities a little bit differently. And what does that look like and what we want to do. I believe that we have to get this right. As businesses transition, whether it be generational transition or the advent of technology that helps to be able to make those transitions different, we've got to make sure that we get this right, in my opinion. So our department, in fact, part of my role, as John mentioned in the introduction, part of my role is to work with the Indiana Economic Development Corporation. We have an economic development division, as you saw on the slide. And part of my role specifically says, I'm going to work with these folks to make sure that we have a focus on agriculture, that we're the folks that can be sitting at the table when a business wants to grow or expand in our state, or if we want to recruit them into the state of Indiana, we make that happen. So really what it allows me to do is to what I refer to as scope the realities. Because we're working with these folks, they very often think about jobs, wages, and those are the numbers that is kind of their report card typically from an economic development standpoint. Nothing wrong with that. That's good. But in agriculture, we have to think about it maybe a little bit differently. It's just a little bit different. So Jeff talked about it. So if POET wants to bring a plant into the state of Indiana, very often, folks on the economic development level may say it's, 40, 50, 60 jobs, something like that maybe, okay? A lot of people would say, well, that's not really very many jobs. I would argue in a lot of our rural areas, those are huge. That's a huge number of jobs that affect these. And the jobs and the wages that they have are important. So part of my role is to scope the realities of what happens when a business wants to come into our state. One, we're a large manufacturing state. Indiana is one of the largest manufacturing states in the country. So they tend to think about things in terms of raw materials going into the process. Well, in agriculture, we have to help them understand what those raw materials are. And what do you do with the raw materials? And do you have the right raw materials to feed into that manufacturing plant, if you will, from an agriculture perspective? And then try to help make sure they understand that the impact of the jobs, whether it's 10 or whether it's 50 or 100, can be very large in rural areas, and that's what we do. One of the ways that we're doing something a little bit different is what we call ag asset maps, and that's an example that you see on the side of the screen. About 18 months ago, we initiated a process and developed what we call the Rural Economic Development Model. We worked with Purdue Center for Regional Development, our commodity groups, Indiana Economic Development Association. And essentially what we've done is we've taken USDA ag census data and we've digitized it and put it in a format that these folks can look at. This map that you see is our hog concentration and hog numbers. So the larger the bubble, the more concentrated or the more number of hogs that are in that area. So when we can go to a local economic development group and help them understand what are the ag assets that are in place in your area. But more importantly, what we're trying to get them to do is not just think about their county or maybe their town or their small city, but to start to think more regionally about how this impacts them. And by having these maps, they start to see, and we've got this on all the crops, all the commodities, even on hardwoods in our state. It starts to allow these folks to think more regionally and know and understand that it's more than just our little town. We have to start thinking about it outside of our little bubble and making sure that we have it. And it's been very, very effective. We've got a lot of excitement around this, and people are figuring it out. And lastly, from an economic viability standpoint in our rural communities, I think the quality of life and what we can do to affect quality of life is really important. A lot has been mentioned about rural connectivity. We're working on that as well. We have a position within state government called the Director of Broadband Opportunities. I've taken it on myself as a personal mission to help him understand how agriculture has to be connected and why it's important. He admittedly knows nothing about agriculture, but I'm taking him out to the farms. I've taken him to businesses to help him understand why the proverbial Fitbit for cows or whatever is important and how you make that information flow so that we get it done. Our legislature and governor last year implemented a grant program called Next Level Funds. It's about $100 million. They've gone through the first round. We know $100 million isn't going to fix the complete problem, but it is an effort to start to say, okay, the areas that are unserved with good connectivity or underserved, we've got to start to work on them and make that happen, and we get involved in that process on a regular basis. The last example down there is Indiana Grown. This is a membership program that was started 5 years ago in our state. I know probably almost every state has this. But basically, it's a way to say that products, whether it's food products or whatever it might be, that are grown, raised, processed in our state, have a certain level of professionalism, if you will, and a certain level of activity. And we're working hard on this. So what we're finding is the diversification on the farm, whether it's livestock, crops, even food happening on the farm level, is growing. The Indiana Grown for Schools is a fairly new program where Indiana Grown members, we're connecting them to their local school cafeterias and their food service folks to, again, I think it was mentioned, this whole local food movement, trying to help members plug into their schools where they can supply food to those schools. And we've had some great efforts around health care. A lot of healthcare facilities are looking to find ways to take food as medicine, if you will, and we've got several examples where this has happened, where Indiana Grown members are supplying locally raised, locally based foods into healthcare facilities to be able to make that a reality for what they want to do. And so I think those are ways that we can help try to make sure that our quality of life in our rural areas is improved. Really what it comes down to, if you think about it, is collaboration. Collaboration is key in this whole effort to be able to make this work. So we as a department are really trying to find ways to think about how we are innovative in our work, we're innovative in our policies that maybe we work through, and more importantly, innovative in the relationships that we have as a department to making sure that we collaborate effectively. And I love this quote because great vision without great people is irrelevant. And it still comes back to the people, and we firmly believe that we have to make that happen to make it successful. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it and look forward to meeting more of you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Our fourth and final speaker of the panel is Sherry Rogge-Fidler, president of the Farm Foundation. Sherry is a fifth-generation farm owner and operator from Nebraska who began her career in London in finance and then with the Boston Consulting Group. Recently, she led a sustainability-focused ag tech firm, was then CEO for a group of 1,000 farms before recently joining Farm Foundation as their new CEO. And after visiting with her yesterday, I also learned that Sherry is a graduate of Harvard University. So please take an opportunity to welcome Sherry to the stage.
Or should we say the Harvard University? Sorry, couldn't resist that. So I am delighted to be here today, and even though Farm Foundation is a multi-stakeholder organization, I've chosen to take a farm-level perspective for my remarks today because I thought it would be complementary to what the other folks have been talking about today. So if you could help me out, I would like to take the pulse of the room to see how many other farmers are in the room today. Can you raise your hand? Let me see. Awesome. That makes me feel good. Well, thank you for all that you do as innovators and leaders, and I hope that you'll share your insights with everyone else in the various sessions over the next few days. So in terms of what I would like to cover today, I'm going to start with a brief intro, and I'm going to be wearing two hats. I'm going to wear my personal farmer hat, and I'm going to be wearing my Farm Foundation hat, so we'll cover that a little bit. And then at the risk of being a bit of a Debbie Downer, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges of being a farmer, that innovation is a solution, and then try to share 3 examples across the U.S. of how innovation is being used across different types of farming systems. Then maybe turn the innovation as a solution on its head for a little bit, so hopefully you'll engage with me there, and then close out with ways that you can collaborate to help with this. So I want to start with my why. It's why I'm here. I'm very passionate, and hopefully you'll pick up some of that from me today. I'm basically sharing my photo album with you here. I'm a fifth-generation farmer. We celebrated our 150th year of farming in Nebraska. And as you just even see from the collection of photos there, we are a family business, just like most of the farming operations across the U.S. So I've shared my family there with you. I also thought it might be good to show literally some of our photo albums. So what you see there is what farmers are often proud of is what we photograph. So we photograph our families, just like all of you do, and we photograph the things that we're proud of or that we've invested in. So you see the first awesome barn that we built when we landed in Nebraska from Germany, there, that little pinstripe barn. You also see some of the equipment that we as a family are proud of, that we've invested in terms of our heavy equipment, our irrigation that came late to our farm in the big scheme of things. What I wanted to show was really our technology and forward-looking aspects of our farm. So I was going to show a photo of all the apps that I have on my phone that we can run our farm with. But I didn't want to show you the brands that we're using and bias you all. But I will just say that I've shared that has been a huge transformation in our farming operation. I was able to check on our irrigation equipment when I was in Ethiopia and see if it was on or offline. And I only somewhat jokingly said I do have challenges using that same technology in parts of the US to check on my irrigation equipment. So that is something we have to fix together. The last picture there, over the last few years in our farming operation, we text each other photos of what's going on. So we text each other our awesome cover crops. We've been doubling our cover crops, so we share photos of that. Last year, we shared no photos of innovations because of that photo you see down there in Nebraska. We had probably the worst year in our 150 years of farming. So we shared lots and lots of flooding photos. Believe it or not, that's our inputs driver that's going to drive across that body of water to deliver our inputs. He has a tower on the other side that he's using to spot, to stay on the road to deliver our inputs. That's just one of many of the photos of that challenging year. There's about 3 slides in here that I could spend the whole time on, and this is one that I could just keep talking about my family farming operation, but I'm going to move on and talk about Farm Foundation, because I imagine some of you aren't familiar with it, and that is a perspective that I'll be taking now too. Our mission is to build trust and understanding at the intersections of agriculture and society. That's a challenge today, and we need to do that through collaboration. We believe we are uniquely positioned to do that because of our multi-stakeholder view. One of our signature events and programs is our roundtable, which you may have heard of, which is exactly that, multi-stakeholders coming together to talk respectfully with each other about the challenges and opportunities and how we can navigate it together. We believe, the first ag think tank in the US, but we have just repositioned ourselves as a new breed of an accelerator, trying to catalyze ideas into action. And one example of that is we helped stand up the Soil Health Institute. It sprung out of some of the work that we were doing, and that's just one example. Over time, we saw ourselves creating more action, and that's where we want to play, is really catalyzing those ideas into action. I do want to take a moment to highlight our next generation programs. And again, we're trying to build them out in a suite of next generation programs to mirror our multi-stakeholder approach. And our Cultivators is our undergraduate program. Ag Scholars is our postgraduate program. And I'm going to embarrass them also and have them raise their hands where you are in the audience right now, over there in that corner. This is our partnership, as the Secretary mentioned, with USDA and ERS. They're graduate students. Please take the opportunity to get to know them. They're an awesome group of students, and we're happy to have them as our first ever Ag Scholar class. But as I said, we're building out a suite. We have congressional fellow programs where we bring them on farm, help them understand the different types of farming operations. We're just launching our Young Farmers program and a Young Agri-Food Leaders program. So later I'll talk about, if you have ideas of people you'd like to nominate for those, we'd like to let you know how you can do that. So we're really proud of that. This is the future, and why we have innovation is for the next generation on our farm and for the leaders in ag. So now I'd like to change gears and talk about, if innovation is the solution, what are the problems we're trying to fix on farm, and to share with you what some of those challenges are as I see them as a farmer. And I came up with this because in our farming operation and others, there's problems we talk about, and there's problems we don't talk about. And that's probably like any other family, that there are things that you just don't talk about. And I thought I'd differentiate those here. And I tried to do them also by the size of the bubbles. So in our family, every day we talk about the weather. In fact, last night at dinner, someone remarked that I talked about the weather 5 times during dinner. I can't help it, I'm a farmer. So that bubble, as you see, is very big. We talk about the weather, we talk about our production and how it's going and what we're doing and the cool techniques we're using. We talk about the markets a lot. So those 3 bubbles are the dominant bubbles there. We also talk about the challenges with labor, shortage of labor or the cost of labor. The economics and financials is also big. That one probably should have been dominant too. And increasingly, we're talking about consumers and what consumers are wanting and how that affects us and what we're growing, the demand side of our business. But what we think about and don't as often talk about is our family and our legacy and concerns about, is the next generation going to take over the farm? 70% of farms in America are going to change hands in the next 10 to 20 years. And there's a lot of concern because there's not clarity on whether there will be a next generation in every operation to take over. So that is a key issue. Even though we're not talking about it as much, we need to also solve for that. Health, healthcare, mental health. That one's a big deal, and we don't talk about that as much. Rural communities, and increasingly some concern about lawsuits from the regulatory and legal environment we live in. So as I think about that and tried to convert it over to this innovation model, I tried to lay them out in the circle of all these challenges that we as farmers are facing. And I have to say, I believe there's no better time to be a farmer, and I need to say that even though I'm talking about the challenges, I truly believe there's no better time to be a farmer than right now because of innovation. But as you lay out these problems here and you see them, and I'll be talking a little bit more about how innovation is really focusing on only about 3 of those in a big way. We can debate this back and forth. There is some innovation going on in the others. But we have to acknowledge that that's actually part of the reason why adoption isn't happening as fast as the VCs in Silicon Valley and the startup companies might like, because we're trying to solve for all these other problems at the same time. So if we want to increase adoption, we have to address the suite of challenges that farmers are facing. So I'm going to be talking about what I consider innovation explosion, because that's how it feels from the farmer perspective, is this explosion of innovation. And first talk about the capital that is really fueling that innovation. On the chart on the left is one that I think is important, and it's talking about how flat. In fact, I often talk about this chart just by going like that public spending in the US has been flat. And China's has skyrocketed and is in fact 2x what the US is right now. And VC capital and private capital has really stepped in to fill the gap. And there's very different, there are very different types of funding. But what you'll see, especially on the technology explosion, is that has really been driven by the private capital. And in fact, private capital, VC capital, just in 2018 was about $17 billion. So we're looking at $5 billion, $10 billion for the public spending, $17 billion just for the venture capital in about 1,500 deals. So that's an explosion, and we're feeling that on the farm. And this map, even though you can't read it, is to make that impact. This is the explosion. This group, actually, if you don't know these maps, I encourage you to check them out. They have a full suite of them. This is just on one element of digitization, but they do them for animal protein, they do them for indoor technology. But from a farmer perspective, we are getting pitched all of these different technologies all the time. And I've just circled the one box there in terms of data management systems, because from our farm, for example, we adopted one of those technologies early on. We are early adopters on our farm. And then the challenge is, as that technology continues to evolve, and there may be better systems out there, it's really difficult for us first to find the time to benchmark them and see, is it really time to switch? The switching costs are huge for us to switch over all of our data over there. And I think it's really important, as we talk about wanting to accelerate adoption, to really understand that suite of challenges and how the farmer is trying to sort through all of these different innovations. It's exciting. And it's wonderful, and that is part of our future, but it is a challenge to sift through all of that. So in terms of adoption rates, I mentioned everybody any VC and any startup wants to scale quickly. The hockey stick curve is what is known for that in terms of scaling quickly. And often they're concerned or frustrated that the adoption isn't going as fast as they might like. Having said that, adoption rates are going fairly well. It varies from the different type of technology, but the point of these graphs is to show that adoption is going rapidly in some areas. Adoption data is really difficult to get, good adoption data, so it really varies. But you'll see that for like the GPS technology, that's probably leading, and some estimates go up to that 80% for some of them. But as you saw, Secretary Perdue mentioned maybe more in that 60% range if you look at the full suite. But the headline is it's increasing at a rapid rate. So what I'd like to do now is take 3 case examples from different types of farming operations to share the type of technology and the problem that it's trying to solve. On row crops, we've talked a little bit more about that already, so I'll do a little lighter touch there, but precision ag is clearly the key thing that's happening in row crops, being adopted well, and really focusing on the problem of efficiency and effectiveness. So that and digitization is going along well. The newer ones with biologicals, I think that's going to be a growth area where we see that adoption curve increasing, as well as some really important breeding going on for drought and flood. Exciting to hear, especially in Nebraska, that there's some seeds that can survive longer underwater. Those are the kinds of things that are needed for adapting to climate change. I was going to do a separate section on organic and conventional, but what I decided to do was integrate it here in the row crop section with one of Farm Foundation's board members who's an organic producer who's adopting some of the same technology that we're adopting on our farm. and to show that different farming systems can adopt that same technology. I won't read the entire quote, but in general, I think it's important to hear directly from farmers and not speak on their behalves, which is why I put the full quote up there, but I'll try to focus on the second half. He's a New York organic producer that's basically dealing with sloped land having a lot of erosion, and so if we just read that last portion together, he says, "We use RTK GPS to keep strip boundaries exact. The near-perfect spacing allows us to manage crops without weed issues. Our camera guidance systems work precisely so that we can use finger weeders to remove weed seedlings from within the narrow rows. These technologies enable us to work much faster and effectively." So overall, I think in row crops, that's the core problem that has been the primary focus of innovation, is that effectiveness and efficiency part. If we turn our attention to California and look at the issues there, some of them are similar, but some are a little different or a different priority, that being, for example, labor and resource management and water issues. And so similarly, I went to one of our board members who's a producer in California, and I think I'm actually going to read this whole quote because there's lots of important stuff here, I think, to unpack. So he says, "In California, the rapidly rising minimum wage rates and work hour limitations create a non-competitive disadvantage for producers in a marketplace that is not adjusting upward for the added labor costs. We are replaceable suppliers of fruits and vegetables, regardless of our locally grown promotions. So we are looking to mechanized harvest as the only remaining option to remain competitive due to our labor costs." So this is something that is a challenge in terms of the lag in what consumers say they value and what they're willing to pay for. And that is, again, a challenge that we have to face in terms of the innovation, is it costs us as farmers and producers and our whole value chain to integrate some of these things. And if the consumers don't pay for it, who's going to pay for it? So that is something we also need to keep striving towards. But this California producer said, he's been looking at robotics and mechanization, but really was trying to employ people, but he's at the tipping point now where he's getting ready to move over towards rapid integration of mechanization and potentially robotics because of the labor situation there. The last case I want to share is indoor agriculture, and it was hard to choose which examples to share. The reason why I wanted to share this one is this notion of, is it a threat or an opportunity? And if you look at it in the most broadest sense of indoor agriculture, taking animal production indoors, it's all about controlled environments. But what we see is some innovative options with aquaculture and with some new regenerative indoor models that are being positioned as opportunities for rural America and potentially the next generation farmers of, if a farming operation needs to make space for their next generation, there may not be economic space in the current business model for the next generation of kids, and they need to think of something additional that the kids can do in their business model. And I think it's intriguing to think if some of these can be that for the next generation. So I share that for that purpose. So into the section of, is innovation the solution or one of the challenges? I think it's both. From the farm level and as a sector and from a business and economic standpoint, I think innovation is the disruptor, actually. And McKinsey in about 2015 did a study where they ranked about 40 different industries and had agriculture at the bottom for its digitization. And so it was ripe for disruption. And I think what we've seen from a lot of the private capital flowing in there is that disruption. I think we hit those 5 variables there in terms of that disruptive nature that's going on across agriculture. And I think I've shared with you, we're feeling that on the farm. I think it's an important disruption for us to get to the next generation of agriculture, but I also think it's important to acknowledge that it's a disruption as well as an opportunity. So this slide is also, hopefully will engage us in some conversation after this presentation. What I see from my perspective is that we're shifting into a new era of agriculture. The first photo I showed in my family's farming operation, that was like the labor era, and for decades and decades and centuries, it was the labor era. As Secretary Perdue shared this morning, we've gone through a big revolution already with the industrialization of ag, really getting to scale economies and efficiencies to be able to feed the world in a very efficient and low-cost way. But partly because of digitization and the innovation, and partly because of the consolidation that I think is going to be happening and already is, from the farm perspective and a business model perspective, I think the opportunity is to shift to a value-based business model for farms. Farms in general capture only about 10 cents on the dollar. I think the opportunity, and I'm already seeing it, is for farmers to either do some of the value-added aspects in the value chain on their farming operation to capture more of that value, or to monetize some of the other aspects of their farming operation, whether that be the data, the carbon maybe in the future. I just see this as a shift that's going on right now to think about what other business models can we as farmers have to capture more of that value. I think it's bumpy. This transformation always is bumpy, whether it's from the disruption of digitization or this transfer that I see going on in business models. And I think we collectively, because all of this matters to us as a society, we need to think about how can we help navigate this transformation through collaboration to solve some of those other problems or to ease that transformation. And what is each of our role in doing that? This has already been mentioned several times, so I won't belabor it, but I do believe that for centuries, farmers have been innovators and co-creators. If you don't know these New York Times articles about the DNA and the discoveries they're making there, I encourage you to check out that article. So I have a couple slides just to close out, and if we want to deal with these in the Q&A section or offline, happy to do that, but I'd encourage us to think through how we can collaborate for this transformation. So what role do we see for farmers and rural communities in our future? I've said in a provocative way, we have the technology to eliminate farmers maybe 50, 100 years from now. Is that what we want or not? And I think we have to be thoughtful about that. Second, can we partner with farmers to navigate this era of disruption and transformation, and how? And third, how can we innovate to solve some of those other challenges in the wheel of challenges that I shared with you, and how can we collaborate to do that? Last, I'd close by inviting you to collaborate with us at Farm Foundation. There's so many ways that we can collaborate, and I've just named a few here. We have forums at the National Press Club monthly. Our upcoming one in March is on gene editing, so you're welcome to join us for any of our forums. They're also audio cast, so you don't have to be present. We have 2 upcoming workshops that tap into this innovation concept. We have a digital ag one and a beginning farmers workshop in the fall. Would love to have you join us there. I already mentioned on the Next Gen programs, would love to get your submissions for who you think would be great to help us build out a diverse set of candidates there. We are in the midst of repositioning and looking ahead to our 90th and 100th anniversary as a Farm Foundation and really crafting those big, bold ideas. So if you have ideas that we could collaborate, and now is the time for that type of input to Farm Foundation. And last, please say hello to our ag scholars throughout the couple of days here and see what you can learn from each other. Our vision is building a future for farmers, our communities, and our world, and I think innovation is a core part of that. So I encourage you to continue the conversation with us through our social media venues, and look forward to the Q&A next. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists. That was an excellent discussion, and we do have an opportunity here to take questions from the audience. We've received quite a few questions, so very, very exciting talks from all of you all, and generated a lot of conversation here. The first question that we have comes from the audience, and can we expect the explosive growth of precision agriculture in the past decade to continue at the same rate, and when does this growth level off? I'll open it up to maybe you, Jeff.
Well, maybe not exactly my area of expertise, but we've learned a lot about it. I grew up on a farm, so I've been watching farming for my entire 54 years on the planet. But I have seen tremendous progress in agriculture. I have seen very steady trends in agriculture. If you look at yields, they have been very, very consistent over all the way back to 1900 when we started keeping track. And if I were a betting man, I like to look at past to go to the future. I think that we can continue to see significant innovation. I mean, people said we would stop seeing yield increases years ago. And I remember about 25 years ago when the yield contest was 300 bushel per acre. And everybody said there's no way we'll hit 300 bushel per acre. And there's probably people in this room that hit 300 bushel per acre. And that's certainly a peak, but people are getting there. So last year's yield contest on yield was 534 bushels per acre. So you can see that we're continuing to trend upward. Yields are not going to stop, and that's going to take innovation. But I think it will continue.
Any other panelists?
I would add that I think it will continue. One of the concerns I have about the importance of rural connectivity in all of our rural areas is, are we stifling the innovation that may be occurring, whether it's for sensors or livestock facilities and integrating technology into those areas? I worry that because we don't have the ubiquitous kind of accessibility and connectivity, are we, the folks like John talked about this morning that want to innovate, they want to find ways to develop new technology, are we stifling that for agriculture because of that? And I think Sherry, made a point toward the end there, looking for value. One of the things that, in my mind, technology can do is help farmers. It's great to be able to produce, but if we know and understand our inputs and take the technology to help us understand how to be more, not only more productive, but maybe more importantly, how to be more profitable, that will allow us then to continue to make sure that our rural communities and our farms are sustainable.
I think that's an excellent point. Any other panelists feel to weigh in?
I was just going to add, I think the rate of adoption depends partly on the changing of generations on farms. As I mentioned, the 70% of farms changing hands, so I think how quickly that changes will potentially affect the adoption curve.
Fantastic. Well, that dovetails right into the next question that we had here, and that talks about, are we getting the cart before the horse somewhat on the innovation front when we think about the inability for many farmers and ranchers across the country to not be able to access the broadband speeds that they need to fully adopt some of these innovative new technologies? Bruce, you covered it, but anyone else feel to weigh in on that particular question?
You just have to have broadband to have that adoption curve continue. So the faster we can get that out there, the faster that adoption curve will move on. It's a must-have.
It's a good question. I think it's a function of identifying what are some foundational things that have to happen to allow technology to scale. One of the things I've seen over the course of my career is you can do these proof of concepts or pilots, and they work. And I tell people these days, I'm less interested in doing a proof of concept or pilot. I'm interested in working on what are the actions we have to take or the levers we have to pull for these technologies to scale. Having broadband access is one. I would say in some regards for things that we want to do, it's about adopting a universal standard, common language, so we can speak to each other digitally based on a common set of standards. And so I think we have to take a step back and say, there's probably a sequence of how we approach these technologies so that they can scale.
I would add, John, I mentioned in the beginning of my remarks, the word imperative for this conference is really, I think, pretty critical. To go back to that quality of life, we've got young people that if we don't figure out how to have the technology, have Wi-Fi, John mentioned this morning about kids didn't care about the electricity being off, but Wi-Fi goes away and, the world stops. But that's also important to be able to bring those young people back, not only to the farm, but to be able to bring them back to our rural communities and have that vitality, because if we don't have the communities and the businesses that are there to support our farmers, then again, we stifle their productivity and the ability for them to be able to be sustainable.
I think we hear that time and time again. Access to broadband, access to health care is also pretty critically important. The next question we have from the audience really follows up from the Secretary's remarks this morning. We have 30 years to achieve our 2050 goals. What innovations make the most sense to prioritize and collaborate towards? What practices create impact quickly? And I'll open it up to...
The example I gave was digitization I think being able to actually analyze these large sums of data that's collected and figure out what are the questions we need to ask and questions we didn't know and make connections that we didn't previously know were possible or important. I like to use the example, how many of you have heard of the UPS no left-hand turn strategy? Any? You know what they did is they started digitizing their fleet of trucks. And as they started to digitize that, they were collecting information on when are trucks standing idling, what are the routes that they take, how much gas are they burning, how much time does it take to make to the final destination. And by having digital data, they analyzed information that they always had, they just couldn't ever consume, and they realized that when their trucks were making left-hand turns, they tend to be idling a little bit longer. It took them a little bit longer, and they came up with this no left-hand turn policy. Don't make a left-hand turn. We'd rather you make 3 right-hand turns to get to your final destination. Saved them a ton of time, and it saved them a ton of money. I share that because I think there are a lot of left-hand turns in our food production systems. And what are the left-hand turns that we simply just don't know? Once we start digitizing and analyzing data, will we be able to eliminate those left-hand turns?
I like how the question included innovative practices, because I think often we think of innovation as technology, but I think innovative practices, business models, and collaborations are also important. So take cover crops and no-till as innovative practices. There, the adoption is pretty low, even though they're doubling each year. So I think we need to keep figuring out how to improve that adoption curve, because I think, as the Secretary said, soil health is fundamental for our future. So that would be on practices. On collaboration, I think unlikely partnerships are a key to getting to our future of trying to be able to collaborate with people that you wouldn't normally collaborate with, especially in our polarized society right now. And then in terms of innovative business models, I think that's another one I've mentioned a little bit in my talk, that we need to think about that for farming operations and help them see alternative, innovative business models.
I agree completely, Jeff.
Innovation and sustainability, I believe, are going to take investment. Obviously, it takes money, right? And all these technologies take money. So I think we need to remember the farmer needs to be profitable. I was at an interesting deal last year. We did some strategic planning for agriculture with a whole bunch of CEOs from all over agriculture, and everybody knew had great ideas, but they got to remember the farmer's got to be profitable to move this stuff forward. And so I think we need to once again remember that this probably sounds self-serving, but we need to make sure there's enough demand for the farmer so he can be profitable. My father built an ethanol plant on his farm when I was a teenager because there wasn't enough demand for his corn, and he was storing 5 years of corn in Quonset and grain bins. There was nowhere to go with it. So as we continue to grow more and more and more, we've got to make sure we have biofuels policies, bioproducts being invented, other things that we make from grain, so that we can keep the farmer profitable as those yields continue to go up, so we can finance sustainability.
I think that hits exactly on what Sherry's talking about. Economic profitability is very important, but we need to find other partners, other collaborators down the supply chain, and I think communicate how important economic sustainability is for the farmers to drive this innovation.
We can make biofuels out of $2 corn, but we want the family farmer healthy. We believe the family farmer is critical to America.
I appreciate that.
Let me touch on collaboration because it's been mentioned a few times, and I'm a strong believer that it needs to happen. But oftentimes collaborations don't take off. People don't want to work together. And one of the things that we need to think about when we talk about collaboration is we need to collaborate in a way that creates shared value. I've actually participated in some of these digital networks where you try to get people to get in, but one entity benefits more than the other. Sometimes it's a large retailer, for example. You have to create shared value for all the participants in that network. And so as we think about collaboration, think about, well, everybody needs to get a win out of participation.
Well, I think the average U.S. consumer spends about 5% of their income on food here in the United States. And you talk about other partners along the supply chain to get this jump started. Who's going to bear the cost of traceability issues, for example, Frank?
Yeah, well, oftentimes people think there's going to be a cost to traceability. One of the things, I worked for a large discount retailer. I would tell you that large discount retailers aren't looking at these type of digital supply chains that they think they're adding cost to the food system. We believe that long-term, by digitizing the food system, you run a more efficient, sustainable food system. You subtract costs from the food system. And I think you can create economic models for people to get in that are little to no cost. You think about all of the social media networks that you participate in. You're probably on Twitter, you're probably on LinkedIn, you're probably on Facebook. How many of you pay a cent to be in it? You don't pay a cent. They figured out models, economic models, to incentivize creation of those networks and people to get in. So we have to be creative in how we think about this. Oftentimes people think, I just want to sell you a subscription service and try to make money. I'm convinced that we can digitize the food system with new economic models that are little or no cost.
The key to what you said is in the long run. And in the short run, that's what the challenge is all of this digitization on our farm. We're at our capacity right now. We can't do anything more right now unless we hire more people in terms of managing our data. And so I think we have to be thoughtful about how can we get over the short-term costs on farm and in the supply chain to get to that in the long run. It will be better.
Fantastic. Anyone else? Well, the next question we have here, the focus on innovation initiatives are clearly critical. However, we haven't heard too much about economic sustainability, profitability, growth. We talked about it a little bit, but from each of your perspectives, how important is that for the U.S. farmer, other agribusinesses along the supply chain to make sure that we've got economic sustainability? How much of a component of your messaging is that?
I think it's critical. I lived through the farm crisis of the 1980s. I watched several of my neighbors go bankrupt and lose their farms and the families kids that I knew. And we don't want to see that again. And I worry we're on the verge of something like that. Certainly there have been some government payouts, but if they ever stop, we're not in a good position. And again, we've got to build demand. And we all got to fight together for demand. So we're fighting all the time against the oil industry to get more of the gas tank. Sometimes we feel a bit like the lone soldier when it impacts all of agriculture, and we would like to have more help in that venue. You look at the small refiner exemptions that were really hard on ag demand. We'd have different prices today. We'd have a different world today. So anything we can do to work together to make sure that the opponent gives us part of the gas tank, because they don't want to give any of that up, guys. Not even 1 gallon they don't want to give up. In fact, they want to go the other direction and take market away from farmers. So ag and oil are in this battle, and I don't think that ag knows they're in it, but oil is well aware they're battling all of you. But I'm not sure all of you know you're battling oil to try to get your prices up.
Bruce?
Sustainability, to me, it really comes down. If farmers aren't profitable and aren't able to be profitable, nothing's going to be sustainable. We have all these definitions. I kind of referred to it earlier. And I know, we have corporations that have their sustainability efforts. I get that. One of the things we're doing in our department is we've actually had some conversations with some of these companies that want to talk about sustainability because they've looked at some of that soil conservation data from the partnership and have started to realize there is some value there. And so is there a way to be able to help with that? I continually emphasize, anytime we have those conversations, if farmers aren't able to be profitable, they're not going to be sustainable, and your sustainability efforts aren't going to accomplish what you want to accomplish. So we've got to remember it starts at the farm in terms of being able to make them profitable and allow them to have markets to be able to make that work. And if we don't have that, then ultimately a corporate or a sustainability goal is just not going to work. It's not going to have any value.
I'm certain there's a willingness to pay for consumers for these things. It's likely a matter of making sure that we get our voice out there so they understand how important economic sustainability is for the farmer. Today, the Secretary announced the Ag Innovation Agenda, which includes the goal of increasing agricultural productivity by 40% and reducing our environmental footprint by 50% by 2050. What's your reaction to this challenge and the framing by the Secretary today?
I thought it was great. Very encouraged by the vision. I think people get inspired by visions more than they do policies and regulations and standards. And so it's imperative, it's needed, and I think it's achievable. It's a daunting goal, but we should be ambitious. And I think there's technologies on the horizon that if we work together, we can do this. More importantly, we have to do this.
Agreed. as he was talking about that, I was thinking of an example we have in our state. We've got a group called the Wabash Heartland Innovation Network. It's about an 8 or 10 county area centered around Lafayette, West Lafayette. So they've involved Purdue University, College of Ag, Engineering. And what it is a large test bed. So they're trying to gather technology from all kinds of providers. They're working at it on the farm. They're working at it in the manufacturing sector. They're looking at from a research perspective. And that's what it's going to take is all of those sectors working together to be able to achieve the kind of goal that USDA's laid out. Again, it's huge, it's large. We probably can't exactly see how we're going to get there today, but that's part of what you have to do to be able to think forward and move the industry forward.
Exactly.
I thought it was exciting to have part of the vision be on the environment and the planet. My hope is that we can talk more openly about it. I've felt like in my role I've had to have my cheat sheet of which terminology I had to use where. Is it changing extreme weather, or is it climate change? And I'm hoping we can just get over that and move to these metrics and the scorecard and just work together to get there. So I thought that was exciting.
Certainly an ambitious goal. The next question we have here, one thing the Secretary spent a lot of time talking about this morning is the past success of American agriculture. Most folks who work in U.S. agriculture agree that we need to do a much better job telling our story. What are your thoughts on how we, in both the private and public sector, can better tell this story to consumers? Volunteers?
I think we need to unite. I think that I mentioned this when I was speaking, that ag has not done a great job of uniting. But if we can get ag companies, biofuel producers, farmers, commodity organizations, and probably also some environmental organizations who have not been our friends, ag supporters, I mentioned Patagonia, Culver's, they're really excited about a sustainable ag agenda. They will invest money in it. They'll help us tell the story. We got to get everybody singing from the same song sheet. It's amazing what happens when nobody cares who gets credit and everybody does their best to tell the same message. So that's what I think this agriculture has got to do. I've never in my lifetime seen that happen, where agriculture came together on a united message. If they did, this is the largest industry in America and the largest industry in the world. It'd have tremendous power if we ever did that.
I think it's important. One of the things I've often thought about the farming community, if you rewind 100 years ago, a lot of people would have been in some way, shape, or form involved in food production. And you fast forward 100 years and just about nobody's involved in food production, and it's farmers. So you have a smaller amount of people producing more food to feed more folks than ever before that are very far removed from farming. And while they're very far removed from farming, they all have an opinion about how you do your work. And so I think storytelling is really important, not only in terms of the success and the great, innovations that have happened, but I think also continue to educate consumers. I think consumer education about ag is really, really critical. It's a big missing part of the food conversation.
I would agree.
I would encourage us to maybe think a little more broadly. I think telling our story is part of it, but not all of it. We already see this going on where, we say it's all about science, and then, we're at like cross purposes of what matters to each other. And just telling our stories, I don't think is enough. I think we have to spend time building trust and understanding, as our mission statement says, listening to each other to understand the perspectives before we can actually achieve change. It's more than just telling our stories. That's part of it, though.
One organization that's really working hard on this is U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance. We did that strategic planning last year. 180 CEOs from all of our agriculture, including agriculture. All the people I just listed here were there. And we did strategic planning for 2 days and came to a unified approach for ag, which I've never seen in my lifetime as well. And that's somebody you should all consider joining, getting to know them. We're now joining their board because we think they have a really great mission to tell this story. Someone's got to take the lead, right? And then we got to get a unified vision, which they have already, and then we all have to start singing out the same song sheet. So that is one organization I think is doing a fantastic job of trying to do what needs to be done.
I think Frank said it well. We know that there aren't very many people, really, when you look at it, especially in this country, that are involved directly in production agriculture. So it is incumbent upon all of the rest of us that are involved in being able to help tell the story and show that. I know for myself, I try to do that when I'm out. In fact, I just had a conversation earlier this week with my communications folks and said, we're going to start to change a little bit of what we do and the events we go to and the events we attend. And what that really, the gist of what I was trying to get to is, we've got to be able to tell this story and help people understand. So that may mean I've got to maybe get out of my comfort zone and get to some of the groups that may not be real comfortable, or I'm not comfortable getting in front of. But I think it is imperative upon all of us to take our little part and try to do that. And I know my counterparts in all the states across the country, they're willing to do it, and they like doing it, and we know that we have to help.
Let me just say, it's so critical, and I agree with your comment about, it's not only telling the story, it's about engaging in a larger food conversation with all stakeholders. We've talked about the promise of innovation and technologies, but we got to have the social license to use them. And so that's why this conversation is so critical.
I'd like to just share one story. I had dinner with one of our ag scholars last night, and she attended our roundtable event, and it's off the record, multi-stakeholders. And she said that it just exceeded her expectations to see very differing views that respectfully engaged to try to understand each other's perspectives in order to try to craft some solutions. And that's what I think we need more of, which is why I'm saying it's beyond storytelling. It's partly storytelling, but that really having these candid, off-the-record conversations to try to craft these, to your point, shared value propositions together. We can't get there without that kind of dialogue.
I would agree. And I think back to Jeff's point, what USFRA has tried to do with creating the hive and bringing all the supply chain partners together to talk and share ag story is a key component of that.
And they're also raising real money. I mean, it's not free, and they've got people there that have money, and so you won't tell this story free. It's going to take investment, but look how big ag is. If we all give a little, we can tell the story.
That's exactly right. Switching gears a little bit, and I think maybe this one, Sherry, might be right along your lines since you're a farmer. How do you view the right to repair movement affecting innovation on the farm and in ag technology?
So I think that, again, I think we have to engage in dialogue on that as well. I have to be careful with my Farm Foundation hat and my personal hat, so I'd probably maybe lob the ball back to someone else here.
I agree. I think we've got to figure out where the balance is on that. As younger people come into farming in particular, they're going to have a very different view on that. They want to be able to use the technology and have access to it. And so I think I understand wanting to be able to own the data and the information and figure out, am I able to touch that or do something with it? So it really continues to be, it goes back, where's the shared, I think she mentioned it well, it's shared value. There's value on both sides of that, so somewhere we can try to figure out how to come together in the middle to make it work.
Yep. We've got about 15 more minutes or so here of questions. I think here we have one for you on Frank, on what would you estimate is the value to digitizing the food system?
Well, I don't know that I can come up with a statistic or a proposition. I've seen some cost-benefit analysis about digitizing food and there being a return on investment, certainly just on traceability alone. Because certainly with some commodities, you've seen these large food scares that has resulted in, the livelihoods of all farmers of that commodity being damaged. And if you were able to pinpoint it and trace back that contamination to just a grower, it would have saved literally hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more. But we'll have to do those. I think we have to do the cost-benefit analysis and figure out, are these technologies scalable? I think for a lot of the use cases, they're important. I always start off with not the technology, but what's the business problem or the public health challenge that we're trying to solve, and then do the math to see if adopting these technologies has a return on investment. In many cases, I think it will.
Anyone else? I think this is a fantastic question. How can we ensure that we're innovating responsibly, specifically being sensitive to job changes due to automation and the expense of new technology to small farms?
I think, I'll go back to my example I used of the importance of ag education starting at the school level and being able to help those folks, those young people, one, understand the opportunity that this industry has. It's phenomenal, it's tremendous. There's just, you just can't imagine the amount of opportunity that there is. But being able to help them understand that they can't just necessarily train for a specific role and job that they'll have forever in their career. They have to learn the skills that will allow them to adapt and to be able to change. They may have to change numerous times, but if you understand that early on, and I think, again, I'll go back to what AgriNovus Indiana is doing, they're trying to help people understand there's a lot of opportunity here, and you may be, have to have some skills in engineering, you may have to have some skills in agronomy, but be able to be flexible and not just pigeonhole yourself into one area is important. That's going to be so critical for the future because we all know it's going to change very rapidly.
I'm often concerned about that. I was concerned about it at my prior employer. I'm concerned about it in my current role with the federal government. We just, number one, have to be mindful. We cannot do this in a way that creates what I refer to as a digital divide. The big players can do this and the small farmers cannot. I'm absolutely persuaded that if we do this the right way, it actually provides incentives for small growers and they can participate. What we're talking about is a digitally connected ecosystem, the food system, that at the end of the day, I'm convinced will result in some disintermediation that gets people nervous, disintermediation. But I actually think that might be good for small growers. If you look at what's happened in developing economies around the world and when farmers get access to some of these tools, you've seen some of these reports when farmers got access to a mobile phone, what happened? Sales increased. And I think they will potentially be able to be linked with buyers. They can compete with some of the larger brick and mortar entities. And so I think if we do this in a way, it helps level the playing field.
So, Jeff?
I think we need to, kind of bouncing off your comments, I think we need to teach more morals and ethics in our school systems, both probably elementary, high school, and even college education. It's and not just in agriculture. I think there's a lot of lack of morals and ethics sometimes in a lot of different areas of society that I see, and I think some people just don't understand that it's a human responsibility to do the right thing. I personally really believe in doing the right thing and have dedicated my life to that, but I meet a lot of people that don't. So I think if we could teach more of it in our school systems and why it's the right thing and why it's a good thing and how it helps the next generation, I think you could maybe gain on it.
Go back to the comment about smaller farms. Again, there's tremendous opportunity. One of the things that Frank talked about, when we think about the Food Safety Modernization Act, when that came out, a lot of people, and I think Frank knows this, a lot of people in that part of the production chain, they were very, very worried. They were very scared that, again, the big arm of government was going to come down upon them. We've got a person in our department, through our State Department of Health, through work with funds through FDA, we're starting to go to the small and medium size. We don't have a lot of the huge produce farms that, say, the West does or whatever. But we're specifically going through education with these folks about looking at what the Food Safety Modernization Act could do to benefit them. And the conversations that are the person that's working on this is having with some of these folks, I just had a conversation about 2 weeks ago with her. She said it's been great because a lot of these folks have understood that this does not need to be onerous, but it can, in fact, be very beneficial to their business. And Frank and I were talking earlier, it doesn't matter what size business. You make somebody sick with their food, and that's not a good day. And I think even small farms understand, whether it's at farmers markets or if they're selling from their farm, you've got to be able to produce a safe product that people are going to enjoy.
I agree. Well, I think you all have brought very interesting and unique perspectives on ag innovation. It certainly helped inform my thinking. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with all of you today on stage, and I'm sure our audience does as well. So please join me in giving the panelists a round of applause.